Please, I don't care what it is, just say something.
I'm sorry, buddy.
Oh, yo, oh. Say something. Why? Why?
These were the voices of people grieving the loss of 5 family members, each one taken in a single horrifying night. But what makes this tragedy even more shocking is that the man responsible for the massacre was no stranger. He was one of their own. In the year 2020, a disturbing call came through to 911. A man calmly confessed that he had just slaughtered his entire family, sparing only one, a toddler he held in his arms when the police arrived at the scene. From the moment he was apprehended, there was no attempt to hide or deny what he had done. Not once. This is the case that not only shocked the police, but also rattled the courtroom with its graphic details and the killer's unwavering admission of guilt from the very start. It leaves us questioning, why? Why would someone do this to their own family? The man at the center of this tragic story is Christopher Stokes. At the time of the horrifying events, he was 44 years old, having been born on July 21, 1975. Although there isn't much information available about his childhood, it was reported that he faced significant challenges growing up. His early life was marked by instability and a lack of positive role models, laying the groundwork for a troubled future. And even though his family was well aware of his past wrongdoings, nothing could prepare them for the nightmare that unfolded on April 27, 2020. This was a time when the entire world was already grappling with the chaos brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. And according to some sources, the overwhelming fear and isolation many people felt during this period played a role in what was about to happen. On that fateful morning, 2 chilling calls to emergency services disrupted the quiet. Stokes made his first call at 10:38 in the morning, calmly stating, I just massacred my whole family, adding that the gun is still upstairs with the bodies. Just 6 minutes later, he called again, declaring, I just killed my whole family with my Mossberg. His demeanor during these calls was disturbingly calm, raising alarms about his state of mind. And according to the criminal complaint, when the police arrived, they found Christopher Stokes sitting outside on the steps of his home with a toddler. Naturally, the officers assumed that the man and the child were surviving victims of the massacre. They approached both of them cautiously, believing they were still in a state of shock. When the officers asked Stokes if he had heard any shots, he chillingly replied, Yeah, I didn't hear them. I did them. At that point, the police were totally in shock, not only because Christopher was calm, but also because he had spared the toddler.
It was Teresa Thomas. My nephew was Demetrius Thomas. My niece was Tierra, and I'm distraught. I need to know what's going on. I'm confused. I'm trying to figure out how you killed 5 people.
When the police entered the house, a camouflage 12-gauge shotgun was found hidden away in one of the bedrooms. Scattered throughout the house were 12 spent shotgun shells, each a grim reminder of the violence that had happened within those walls. Tragically, all 5 victims were found shot multiple times. Now, let's delve into the heartbreaking details of who was in the house that day and who lost their lives. Among the victims was his on-again, off-again girlfriend, Teresa Thomas, who was 41 years old. They shared a son, Demetrius Thomas, who was just 14, along with Teresa's 16-year-old daughter, Tara Agee. 2 others, Lakeitha Stokes, aged 17, and Marcus Stokes, 19, were also killed. They were Christopher's niece and nephew. Remarkably, Stokes spared his 3-year-old grandson, who reportedly pleaded with him not to hurt him. Just imagine the trauma this child has endured, witnessing such horrific violence at such a young age. At 3, a child is aware enough to say, "Please don't hurt me." And it's heartbreaking to think about how this experience will shape his life moving forward. But the real issue goes beyond the shock of the crime itself. When Christopher Stokes entered his plea deal, it raised serious questions. He repeatedly stated, "Yes, I did it," which made people wonder about his mental state. Did he suffer from any mental illness? Was he battling depression at that time? How could he make the horrific decision to kill his entire family? By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Now, to really understand what might have led to this tragedy, you have to look at his past. As mentioned earlier, Christopher had a long history of run-ins with the law, especially when it came to domestic violence. Back in 2002, he was convicted of misdemeanor battery and got sentenced to probation, along with being required to attend domestic abuse counseling. On top of that, he wasn't allowed to own any firearms. Then, 5 years later, in 2007, things got worse. He pleaded guilty to felony battery, bail jumping, and intimidating a witness. That got him 4.5 years in prison, and once again, no firearms. But it didn't stop there. In 2012, he ended up in court again, this time for another misdemeanor battery with a domestic abuse modifier, which landed him another 18 months behind bars. And in 2016, the State Department of Workforce Development filed a warrant against him seeking unpaid unemployment compensation, totaling $13,304. Unfortunately, the online records provide limited information regarding the details of this case. According to Ben Jed, a spokesman for the Department of Workforce Development, such cases are treated as confidential under state law. Fast forward to 2017, and he's back with another misdemeanor, disorderly conduct, which got him a month in jail. So, it's pretty clear that this wasn't some one-time thing. Christopher had a pattern of violent behavior, particularly towards women, which makes this whole situation even more tragic. Most of his past charges were probably tied to domestic violence, and it's no real surprise that his final horrifying act was against those closest to him, his on-and-off girlfriend, his children, and other family members. Out of the 5 people he killed, 3 of them were women, which shows he had deep-rooted issues with violence, especially against women, that just spiraled out of control. In the end, the court decided that Christopher was mentally fit to stand trial. They determined that he was sane when he committed the murders and fully understood what he was doing. While his actions were tragic and unforgivable, the legal system made it clear that mental illness wasn't the cause of his decision to commit this horrible crime. However, his attorney claimed that he had sought mental health services before the murders, admitting he was starting to hear voices. This was right at the beginning of the pandemic, a time when many struggled to access the care they desperately needed. With the world shifting to virtual support, countless individuals found themselves without the in-person help that could have made a difference. This environment undoubtedly impacted many lives, including his. And although what he did was completely wrong, some people can't help but give him a tiny bit of respect for admitting to his actions and pleading guilty right from the start. By doing so, Christopher Stokes spared his loved ones from the agony of sitting through a long, painful trial, full of drawn-out denials and excuses. Time after time, we see people commit horrendous crimes and then force their families, as well as the victims' families, to endure a lengthy court process where they lie, deflect, and insist on their innocence. But Stokes, at least, owned up to what he did right away. That said, his admission didn't exactly bring peace to those left behind. Yes, his plea deal may have shortened the courtroom proceedings, but the heartbreak, anger, and confusion still consumed the family. In fact, during the hearing, his sister, who was undoubtedly full of grief, spoke up and demanded answers, shouting at him to say something, anything, to explain what he had done.
I need you to say something to me, Chris. Please, I don't care what it is, just say something.
Another family member, so overwhelmed by her emotions, had to be escorted out of the courthouse because she couldn't stop asking Christopher, why?
Why? for, but we really do hate him for that. We still love him because he's our uncle, but I mean, can we forgive him for what he did? No, we can't. Do we understand it? No, we don't. So it's like we just got to take it a day at a time.
In response to all of this, Christopher Stokes had something to say, and he didn't hold back. Sitting in court, he expressed his thoughts candidly. "I did the ultimate sin. I deserve to be locked up. I deserve everything I get. I'm not asking for leniency or anything like that. I deserve it. No one in the world should have done what I did." He further added,
"I woke up and I just had blood on my mind. I can't say it no other way."
You'd think those words might bring some sense of closure or understanding to the horrendous situation, but in reality, they only added to the pain. It's almost infuriating to hear him acknowledge his actions while still grappling with the horrific reality of what he did. He clearly knew right from wrong, yet he chose to commit this unimaginable act. When it came time for sentencing, the judge delivered a staggering verdict: 40 years for each victim. Add in another 5 years for illegally possessing a firearm as a convicted felon, and that brought his total to an astonishing 205 years. The law is pretty unforgiving in cases like this, and rightfully so. However, before handing down such a harsh sentence, they needed to make sure Christopher was mentally fit to stand trial. They wanted to confirm there were no underlying mental health issues that could have influenced his ability to enter a plea deal. And after being evaluated by 2 doctors, the conclusion was clear. Christopher was mentally fit to understand his actions and face the consequences. In an interview with the Journal Sentinel, Stokes' attorney expressed profound concern about his client's state of mind, stating that his actions were not something a sane person, a normal person, would do. And when it comes to the victims of this heartbreaking family tragedy, family members have made it clear that there was absolutely no reason for Christopher to take such drastic actions against his loved ones. Teresa, the mother at the center of it all, was known for her loving nature and dedication to her kids. She was that kind of mom who was always involved in her children's lives, making sure they had everything they needed, emotionally and physically. Then there's Demetrius, Christopher's son, who was just a teenager but had a bright future ahead of him. Known for his friendly demeanor, he was well liked among his friends and peers. In fact, he was gearing up for college, dreaming big and excited about the future. He had so much to look forward to, and it's incredibly tragic to think that his life was cut short so abruptly. Tara Agee, Teresa's daughter from a previous relationship, was another vibrant light in the family. This young girl was active in school and took part in various extracurricular activities. She had that contagious energy that brought everyone together, and she shared a close bond with her family and friends. The other 2 victims, Marcus and Lakeitha, were siblings, and even though it's not entirely clear why they were there during the killings, their mother, Tilicha Stokes, was completely blindsided by the news. The shock of losing her children in such a horrific way was too much to bear. "The images just keep playing over and over and over," she shared, her pain evident in every word. "I am never going to hear my daughter sing again. I am never going to hear my son's voice again." It was reported that the services for the victims were held separately, and each one served as a harsh reminder of the impact this crime had on the families and friends left behind. Even the mayor of the town couldn't stay silent about this shocking case.
Mayor Tom Barrett was also on scene.
A horrific scene, again, 5 family members. There is a child who's at the hospital right now, and I think that child is fine. But
I am sick to my stomach right now with this violence, you know.
It's too much stuff going on. It's already coronavirus and stuff going on, so what makes y'all people just need to think before they react.
Yeah, I feel like it's my own family. You feel just like my own family.
The graphic nature of the crime stirred deep emotions, especially given the alarming context of rising violence in Milwaukee. In 2020, the city faced a staggering spike in homicides, with a total of 189 murders by the end of the year. This figure was nearly double that of 2019 and shattered the previous record set back in 1991 by more than 14%. The surge in violence was linked to a mix of factors at that time, many of which stemmed from the unprecedented challenges brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. Lockdowns, economic hardships, and social unrest all contributed to a perfect storm of chaos and desperation. Just 2 months before the devastating Stokes family tragedy, Milwaukee was already shaken by another heartbreaking event. In February, 5 people tragically lost their lives in a shooting at the Molson Coors Brewing Company campus, one of the city's biggest employers. The shooter, a 51-year-old employee of the company, also took his own life after the attack. Authorities later confirmed he died from self-inflicted wounds. What makes this tragedy also chilling is that, to this day, no clear motive has been uncovered. His reasons remain a mystery, much like how we still don't fully understand why Christopher Stokes carried out the brutal massacre of his own family. The shooting took place in the early afternoon, around 2:08 p.m. local time, while hundreds of employees were still at work. It was a scene of chaos and disbelief as the city grappled with yet another act of violence. Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett spoke about the incident during a news briefing shortly after it happened, calling it a tragic day for the city and labeling the shooting as a horrific act. Police Chief Alfonso Morales confirmed that all 5 victims were employees at Molson Coors. He commended the swift response of the city's police, FBI agents, and firefighters, who worked tirelessly to manage the aftermath of the attack. The 5 victims were simply going about their day, working at the brewery, when their lives were abruptly taken. In the wake of the shooting, condolences poured in from various leaders. President Trump, during a news conference, expressed his sorrow for the families affected, calling the incident a terrible thing. Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers extended his thoughts to the families of those senselessly lost, emphasizing the long-lasting impact of such gun violence on both the local community and the state. This shooting marked the 11th mass shooting in Wisconsin since 2004, according to Wisconsin Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes. He took the opportunity to call for action, saying, "I want to issue a call, a challenge, because we shouldn't accept this. We should never grow comfortable in the face of these repeated tragedies. We have a duty to act."
That is one of my biggest fears, bigger fears, this happening again in our community. But even a bigger fear than that is the fact that it won't faze anybody at some point. People will just look at it and think this is just the way that it is.
But it seems like this statement about the need for action didn't quite hit home, as just 2 months later, Milwaukee was shaken by another shocking murder. And that is the very case that we have just deep dived, the Stokes family massacre. And sadly, tragedies like this continued to haunt Milwaukee up to this day. Fast forward to December 24th, 2021, when yet another crime shattered the city. On that fateful evening, Torres Betancourt, just 27 years old, was on her way to a Christmas party with her fiancé and young son when gunfire erupted on the 1300 block of South 29th Street. A stray bullet pierced her car door, tragically striking her in the upper body. In a heartbreaking turn of events, she lost her life, while miraculously, no one else in the car was harmed. Initially, investigators had very little to work with, only discovering a spent bullet shell on the ground nearby. However, as they broadened their search, they found that shots had been fired about a quarter-mile away outside a corner store on the 1200 block of South 33rd Street shortly before the shooting that claimed Torres Betancourt's life. Police recovered 5 casings from that scene, and an analysis revealed they were likely fired from the same gun that killed Torres. Surveillance footage from the store showed a man who officers recognized as Raymond King, a suspect they were familiar with due to prior encounters. King, who was just 19 at the time, initially faced serious charges, including first-degree intentional homicide and 2 counts of first-degree recklessly endangering safety, both as a party to a crime. However, in March, he pleaded guilty to second-degree reckless homicide. In a decision that left many in shock, Judge Wagner sentenced him to 8 years in prison, aligning with a recommendation from Assistant District Attorney Paul Tiffin. With credit for the 627 days he had already spent in jail awaiting trial, King could potentially be released after only 5.5 years behind bars. Some people can't help but wonder about the notion of justice in situations like this. While Christopher Stokes' sentencing might seem like a form of closure for the victims' families, it doesn't erase the deep-rooted pain or tragic loss. The violence tied to his story, and others like it, continues to cause pain for the families involved, leaving scars that sentencing alone cannot heal. So, what do you think about this? How can we work together to prevent tragedies like this from happening again? We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. They say, be careful who you let into your home. But here's a question. If you were Cheryl, would you open your door in the middle of the night for your ex-convict brother-in-law? Well, this video says it all. On the 22nd of July, 1977, Connecticut witnessed what was at the time its largest mass murder, a crime so horrifying that the state's Supreme Court described it as brutal and apparently motiveless. And trust me, the gruesome details will haunt you long after you hear them. And we're not here to sensationalize. It's raw, real, and devastating. And just like always, we're peeling back the layers of this nightmare to uncover what really happened to the Bodan family. Let's start by getting to know the family and their world. The Bodan family lived in a small, tight-knit community on Cedar Hill Drive in Prospect, Connecticut. Back in 1977, this little town had a population of just over 6,500 people. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other, and the charm of rural life created a sense of peace and safety. This close-knit vibe might seem like a small detail, but trust me, it plays a key role in what unfolded later. Now, let's talk about the Bodan household because it wasn't just your typical family. There were 10 people living under one roof. At the head of the family was Frederick Bodan, the father, and Cheryl, the mother, who was only 29 at the time. Together, they had 7 children ranging from toddlers to preteens. The eldest, 12-year-old Frederick Jr., was followed by 10-year-old Sharon Lee, 9-year-old Deborah Ann, 8-year-old Paul, 6-year-old Roderick, 5-year-old Holly Lynn, and 4-year-old Mary Lou. If that wasn't enough, their 6-year-old niece, Jennifer Santoro, also lived with them. With so many young lives in the mix, their home must have been a lively and chaotic place, full of the everyday ups and downs of a big family. And as you can imagine, the Bodan family had a pretty lively and fun time together, and that was definitely true on the night of Thursday, July 21st, 1977. The 8 kids were enjoying themselves, swimming and playing around in their neighbor's pool in Prospect, Connecticut. The air was filled with laughter, splashes, and carefree moments, just a typical summer evening. Now, life for the Bodan family wasn't exactly about luxury, but they weren't struggling either. They had enough to get by and were grateful for what they had. Despite not being wealthy, they created a warm, loving home that radiated happiness. On that particular night, Cheryl, the mom, was keeping an eye on the kids while they were having a blast at the pool. Meanwhile, Frederick Bodan, the father, was working his 3rd shift at the Pratt & Whitney factory, trying to provide for his family. But then, things took an unexpected turn when a man showed up at the pool. Now, this man was no stranger. In fact, the kids were thrilled to see him. The neighbor recalled how they all rushed over to greet him, showering him with hugs and kisses. It was clear that he was someone they knew well and trusted. After a little while, the kids wrapped up their fun in the pool and went home with this man, while the neighbor went inside, and the evening continued as it would for any other family. But little did anyone know, this night would soon take a dark and tragic turn that would change everything forever. Around 4:15 in the morning, the quiet of the early hours was shattered when neighbors started to smell smoke. At first, they thought it might be someone burning leaves or trash. But then they heard something far more alarming, screams coming from the Bodan house. That's when they realized something was seriously wrong and quickly called 911 to report the fire. Fire trucks from both Prospect and the nearby town of Bethany rushed to the scene, sirens piercing through the night. The firefighters worked tirelessly, and after about 30 minutes, they managed to extinguish the blaze. But what came next was something no one could have prepared for. As the smoke cleared and the flames died down, firefighters began searching the house. Inside, they discovered an unspeakable tragedy. The bodies of Cheryl Bodan, her 7 children, and her 6-year-old niece, Jennifer Santoro, were found throughout the home. Each one had been brutally killed before the fire. Cheryl's charred body was found on the kitchen floor. 3 of the children were discovered in one bedroom, while 2 more were in another. 1 child was found in the master bedroom, and 2 more were located in the bathroom. The scene was nothing short of horrifying. Adding to the nightmare, many of the victims, including Cheryl, had their hands tied behind their backs. 2 of the children had their feet bound, and everyone appeared to have suffered severe head injuries before the fire consumed their bodies. It was a crime of unimaginable cruelty, and the sheer brutality shocked even the most experienced investigators. All of the bodies were burned extensively, said Edward P. Leonard, the state police commissioner at the time. His statement only hinted at the unimaginable horror that firefighters and police had witnessed. Some neighbors later admitted they had woken up to the smell of smoke but didn't immediately think much of it. It wasn't until they heard the chilling screams that they realized the danger and called for help. One neighbor, Joseph Paulino, tried to help. He ran to the Bodan house and attempted to enter, but the fire was already too intense. He later recounted the terrifying scene, saying, "I opened the back door and got driven back by a blast of heat. Then the picture window blew out." As mentioned earlier, Frederick Bodan, the father of the family, was at work at the Pratt and Whitney factory in North Haven, working the 3rd shift. Around 5:30 in the morning, police arrived at his workplace to pick him up. They didn't tell him what had happened, only that he needed to come with them. They drove him to his mother's house, where the family's Reverend Joseph Donnelly was waiting to deliver the devastating news. After hearing it, Frederick turned to Reverend Joseph with a question that no parent or spouse should ever have to ask. Are they all dead? Joseph's somber response confirmed his worst fears. Everything Frederick held dear, his wife, his children, his entire family, was gone in one horrifying night. Shattered by grief, he reportedly said through tears, "There's only one thing, to see the bastard pay." But while Frederick was dealing with this unimaginable loss, investigators were already working tirelessly to find answers. They set up a command post at Prospect Town Hall and began stopping every car traveling along Route 68. They were determined to leave no stone unturned. Additionally, back at the Bodan home, police continued their investigation. That's when they noticed something strange. All the doors and windows were locked. This raised an alarming question. How could the killer have escaped if everything was locked from the inside? It pointed to the chilling possibility that whoever committed the crime was already inside the house or somehow locked the doors behind them. Naturally, the investigators started talking to neighbors. That's when they learned about a man named Lorne Aquin, the very same man who visited while the kids were enjoying their time at the neighbor's pool. But that wasn't all. The neighbors said they saw him again early Friday morning, sitting alone in a black sedan parked in a nearby church parking lot, about a mile from the house. This information raised red flags for the investigators. Who was this man? And why was he hanging around the house before and after the tragedy? The neighbors filled in more details about Lorne's connection to the Bodan family. As it turns out, he wasn't just some random figure on the periphery of their lives. For about 2 years, he had actually lived in their basement. Then, out of the blue, he left, vanished from their lives. But just as abruptly as he had disappeared, he reappeared on that fateful Thursday night, the same night the Bodan kids had been swimming at the neighbor's pool. Meanwhile, investigators couldn't afford to overlook anyone, not even Frederick, the grieving father. In the early stages of any investigation, the people closest to the victims are often scrutinized. So when officers asked Frederick for permission to search his truck, he didn't hesitate. He had nothing to hide. The search came up clean. No evidence, no suspicious items. But it was a necessary step in ruling him out. By the time the investigation hit the 24-hour mark, it was already a whirlwind of activity. Police weren't wasting a second. They had set up roadblocks, spoken to neighbors, and interviewed over 100 witnesses, including both Frederick and Lorne. Every detail was critical, and no piece of information was too small to be considered. However, when officers ran Lorne Acquin's name through their system, what they uncovered was far more troubling than anything they had heard from the neighbors. This wasn't just a man with a few minor run-ins with the law. His criminal record revealed a pattern that painted him as someone with a dangerous, unpredictable streak. In April of 1974, Lorne was sentenced to prison for larceny. He served less than a year before being released in February of 1975, but freedom didn't suit him for long. By March of 1976, he was back behind bars after attempting to escape custody, a desperate and reckless act that hinted at his bold, unrestrained nature. After serving time for that charge, he was paroled in September of 1976. Now here's the part that truly raised red flags. When the tragedy at the Bodan house happened, Lorne had only been out of prison for 7 months. 7 months. That's hardly enough time to rebuild a stable life, let alone prove himself as a changed man. And yet, here he was, connected to the scene of one of the most devastating crimes the community had ever witnessed. For investigators, the timing and circumstances surrounding Lorne's reappearance were impossible to ignore. His criminal past, combined with his strange behavior in the days leading up to the tragedy, created a picture that was hard to dismiss. Why had he returned to the Bodan home after being gone for so long? Why was he spotted sitting in a black sedan in a nearby church parking lot the morning after the fire? To make matters even more intense, investigators uncovered a shocking twist. Lorne wasn't just some random person with a criminal past. He was actually Frederick's foster brother. Talk about a wild turn of events. On the morning of July 22nd at around 9:30 a.m., investigators went over to Lorne's apartment, asking him to come in for questioning. To everyone's surprise, he agreed without hesitation. He calmly went with them to the police station, but what happened next took everyone off guard. Lorne didn't just answer questions, he laid it all out. He was ready to confess. And he didn't just give some vague or wishy-washy response. Instead, he gave a chilling, detailed account of the crime that sent shivers down everyone's spine. He admitted to attacking his sister-in-law and the children. To make sure they were on the right track, police didn't just stop at one round of questioning. They asked him the same questions 3 different times, and each time, his story stayed exactly the same. Even when they brought in his psychiatrist to talk to him, Lorne didn't back off from his confession. At this point, it was clear as day. Lorne was the one responsible. He was arrested and charged with 9 counts of murder and 1 count of arson. But the investigators weren't taking any chances. They made him write up a full confession, a 7-page document that spelled out every detail of what had happened. The facts were so specific and accurate that no one else could have known them, certainly not from the news or outside sources. It was all from Lorne himself. But that's not where the story ended. Later that day, on July 23rd, investigators found even more damning evidence. A trash bag filled with bloody clothes was found near Lorne's driveway, and even more chilling, bloody shoes and socks were discovered in the trunk of his car, the very same car that people had seen him parked in at the church the night of the crime. All of this lined up perfectly with what Lorne had confessed. The evidence was stacking up like a mountain, pointing directly at him. But if you'd think that at this time the case was closed and Lorne is locked up for good, Well, not quite. Things were about to take another unexpected turn. Even though everything seemed to be going in the direction of a quick conviction, Lorne's defense team wasn't ready to throw in the towel just yet. They were still looking for ways to create doubt, to turn the tide in their favor. While the evidence against him was stacking up, his confession, the bloody clothes, the witnesses, his lawyer was fighting tooth and nail to poke holes in the prosecution's case. John R. Williams wasn't going to let it slide without putting up a serious challenge. Even with everything seemingly pointing to Lorne's guilt, the defense team started pushing for a delay, arguing that the court had overstepped by requesting a blood sample from Lorne without solid evidence. They wanted the confession and the blood evidence excluded from the trial, and they tried to introduce new theories like the possibility that Cheryl's brother might be the real killer. But the court wasn't buying it. They saw the evidence for what it was, clear, consistent, and chilling, and refused to allow the defense to shift the focus elsewhere. The trial continued as planned, and when the jury was finally sworn in on July 16, 1979, it felt like the final chapter was getting closer. Then came the day everyone had been waiting for, the public reveal of Lorne's confession. And let me tell you, it didn't disappoint. It was a detailed, gruesome account of everything he had done. Lorne confessed to killing Cheryl, her children, and others, describing each moment with cold precision. He even talked about how he went to the house in the evening to pick raspberries with the kids before the violence began. It was hard to believe, but Lorne's story didn't end there. According to him, after leaving the house around 8:30 p.m., he came back in the early hours of the morning, around 2 or 3 a.m., slipping inside through the unlocked basement door. Once in the kitchen, he casually turned on the light, and that's when Cheryl came down to see what was going on. According to Lorne, she didn't seem too surprised to see him, and when he asked to grab some tools from the basement to fix his car, she let him go without a second thought. But things quickly took a deadly turn. After getting the lug wrench, Lorne came back upstairs and asked Cheryl for a beer. She didn't think anything was off about it. After all, he was family, right? But the moment she turned her back to get the beer, Lorne hit her over the head with the lug wrench. And that wasn't the end of it. He kept swinging, hitting her over and over again without hesitation. The worst part? Lorne claimed Cheryl didn't make a sound. She didn't scream, didn't cry for help. I can't even imagine what was going through her mind at that moment. Was she trying to stay quiet so she wouldn't alert her children? Was she hoping to survive this attack without drawing attention? Unfortunately, it didn't work. One of the kids heard the noise and rushed to the kitchen, only to be struck by Lorne with the same wrench. From there, he went on to attack the other children, using the wrench and a tire iron. But when he heard Cheryl moaning in the kitchen, meaning she was still alive despite the brutal blows, he went back and started stabbing her. Lorne later confessed to the police that he tied up some of the children with string and then tragically assaulted 10-year-old Sharon before killing her. Just think about the horror this poor child experienced. Beaten senseless and then assaulted at just 10 years old. After all of that, he drenched everyone, Cheryl and the children, in gasoline and set the entire house ablaze. However, when Lorne took the stand on September 5, 1979, his story took a complete turn. He denied everything he had confessed to. He said, "I didn't do any of that." He claimed that he only signed the confession because his psychiatrist told him it would be better for him. According to Lorne, the psychiatrist had said, "You'd be better off if you signed." Lorne also claimed that he repeatedly requested a lawyer during his interrogation, expressing his desire to speak with one over and over. However, the police repeatedly denied his requests, insisting that they already knew he was guilty. They urged him to simply confess, convincing him that it would be better for him if he did. When questioned about the bloodstains on his clothes, Lorne offered an unusual explanation. He claimed that the blood wasn't from the murders, but from a fight he had gotten into the night of the killings. According to Lorne, he had been out for coffee when some men outside the cafe attacked him. In retaliation, he said he fought back and ended up beating them. That's where the blood came from, he insisted. It was a strange and highly unlikely story that left many people skeptical of his account. The situation took an even more bizarre turn when Lorne described his reaction upon learning about the murders. He stated that when the police first informed him about the killings, he was so enraged that he punched a wall in the police barracks. He claimed that in his anger, he warned the state trooper, telling him that they better catch the killers before he did. Now, during the trial, the prosecutors introduced a photo of the 7 murdered children showing their innocent faces, which had never been seen by the jury before. This photograph led Lorne's lawyer to argue for a mistrial, suggesting that the emotional impact of the image could unfairly influence the jury's opinion. However, the judge dismissed the motion, and the trial continued without interruption. As the case progressed, certain pieces of evidence seemed to lend some credibility to Lorne's version of events. For instance, the way he reacted when first informed of the murders mirrored exactly what he had claimed in his confession. This alignment raised questions about whether he had actually committed the crimes or if he had been coerced into admitting to them. Moreover, a state police fingerprint expert testified during the trial that the bloody handprint found in the bathtub wasn't Lorne's. In fact, the handprint on one of the door jambs didn't match his either. This revelation raised further doubts about his involvement, particularly since the prints didn't match any of the victims, or even Frederick, the father. There was also the matter of a prior interview with Lorne, conducted in October of 1977 by reporter Lincoln Milstein from the local newspaper, The Current. This interview, which had been kept under wraps until the confession was released, revealed even more contradictions. Lorne admitted to Milstein that he had no recollection of the killings. The only things he remembered were vague snippets: talking to Cheryl, seeing bodies and blood everywhere, and the house being on fire. He claimed that he had been so frightened and confused by what had happened that he didn't remember the events clearly. However, things took a turn in October 1977 when Lorne was transferred to a state mental hospital in Middleton for security reasons, and a few weeks later, he was officially committed. A psychiatrist testified that he might be suffering from schizophrenia or epilepsy, raising doubts about his mental state at the time of the confession. With this in mind, some argued that his statements were unreliable, and this further questioned his accountability for the crimes. Fast forward to October 1979, the jury deliberated for hours over the course of 3 days before finding Lorne guilty on all counts of murder. They did not charge him with SA, despite speculation that he might have been driven to kill after feeling ashamed of allegedly molesting one or more of the Bodan girls. Chief Assistant State's Attorney Walter Scanlon suggested this could have been the motive, although it was never definitively proven. The state tried to get the maximum possible prison sentence of 245 years, which is 25 years for each murder and 20 years for arson, but Judge Walter Pickett sentenced Lorne to 105 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 50 or 55 years. The decision was made, but it didn't take long before Lorne's attorney filed an appeal, so quickly, in fact, that it seemed as though the appeal had been pre-written and ready to go. However, the court denied his appeal, and Lorne was sent to prison. Over the years, Lorne continued to fight his conviction, filing petitions for a habeas corpus trial. Despite his efforts, each petition was rejected, and his legal battles seemed to go nowhere. And for those unfamiliar with the term habeas corpus, it refers to a writ used to bring an accused person from a different jurisdiction to the court in the place where the crime occurred, essentially allowing for the review of the case. In Lorne's case, he argued that he was wrongfully convicted and that his confession should not have been used against him. Lorne was eventually transferred to McDougall Walker Correctional Facility in Suffield, Connecticut, where he spent 38 years behind bars. During this time, he accumulated 8 disciplinary offenses, including assault, possession of drugs, contraband, and other violations. His last infraction occurred in 1997 when he was charged with assault and refusing to provide a specimen. Then, in June of 2015, Lorne's health took a drastic turn. He was placed on a ventilator in the intensive care unit after suffering a severe medical crisis. As the Department of Correction indicated, Lorne had no family willing or able to make medical decisions for him. The judge was called to make a decision regarding his care, but before the meeting could take place, Lorne passed away from a severe brain bleed. He was 65 years old at the time of his death, having entered prison at the age of 27. His death remained shrouded in mystery as no autopsy was performed and the cause of the brain bleed was never determined. Following his death, Robert DeClark, the former owner of the funeral home, sought and received custody of Lorne's remains. After performing a cremation, Lorne's ashes were stored, and DeClark periodically brought them to the Department of Correction in the hopes of finding any relatives who might come forward. But no one did, and to be honest, it feels like Lorne got exactly what he deserved: alone and forgotten. No child, not even Cheryl, deserves a death like that. The violence, the cruelty, it's almost impossible to wrap your mind around. The lingering heartbreak must have been unbearable for the remaining family, especially Fred, the father. Can you imagine the gut-wrenching realization that it was his own foster brother who had claimed the lives of his loved ones? It must have been indescribable. So that brings us to the million-dollar question. Was the sentence just, or did Lorne somehow slip through the cracks with a punishment that didn't quite fit the crime? I'd really love to know what you think about all this.
You were kind of the primary suspect in this homicide investigation. You still are. What are your thoughts about that, and what are your emotions right now? What's kind of going through your head?
It's very stressful, but I hope they will be found, and I hope we can move forward from this.
A face that looks innocent and a body that can't seem to stay still. That was Robert Leeming. At first glance, he appeared harmless. But once you dive into the full context behind that interview, you'll quickly realize he's anything but innocent. In May of 2019, his live-in partner and her young child vanished without a trace for weeks. While Robert was out giving interviews, investigators were working tirelessly to uncover the truth. And what they discovered next will make you question everything you thought you knew. The horrifying details were so chilling and brutal that the case earned him the nickname Canada's Chris Watts, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why. To really dive into this story, let's rewind to 2017. That's when Jasmine Lovett and Roby Anderson welcomed their first baby, a daughter named Aaliyah Sanderson. At the time, Jasmine and Roby weren't married, and they were both pretty young. Jasmine was in her early 20s, and by all accounts, she was a strikingly beautiful woman. With her long dark hair, dark eyes, full lips, and a perfect little nose, she was definitely someone you'd notice, not to mention the cute freckles across her face. Truly, she was stunning. But as with many relationships, things weren't as perfect as they may have seemed on the outside. After Aaliyah was born, cracks started to show in Jasmine and Roby's relationship. According to reports, Roby began coming home later and later, leaving Jasmine alone with their newborn. Then, things took a turn for the worse when he started showing up drunk or high. That behavior only escalated, and soon Roby was becoming more aggressive. One day, Roby came home, and things quickly escalated when he aggressively demanded money from Jasmine. She was terrified for her safety and ran into the bathroom to call the police. By the time the police arrived, Roby was gone, and since Jasmine hadn't been physically harmed, they told her there wasn't much they could do at that point. However, Jasmine managed to get an emergency protection order against Roby. But just 13 days later, the order was revoked after Jasmine and Roby claimed they had worked things out. They told authorities they didn't need the order anymore, though the details of what happened between them during that time remain unclear. What we do know for sure is that Jasmine and Roby eventually split up, and Jasmine got custody of Aaliyah. After the breakup, Jasmine and Roby managed to keep things relatively civil. They focused on co-parenting and tried their best to maintain a peaceful environment for their daughter, despite the challenges of their past. Keep in mind that this all took place in 2018, and during all the emotional turmoil, Jasmine found solace in her family, whom she was very close to. Reports mention that Jasmine was especially close to her mom and sister. They often gathered for family dinners, and she kept them updated on everything happening in her life. After months of navigating heartbreak, Jasmine decided it was time to start putting herself out there again, so she joined a few dating sites in hopes of meeting someone new. And it wasn't long before Jasmine met Robert Leeming, a man who seemed to meet her high standards. At the time they met, Robert was 34 years old, about 10 years older than Jasmine, who was in her mid-20s. While the age gap wasn't huge, it was still noticeable. Robert was originally from the United Kingdom, but had moved around a lot as a child due to his father's military career. This constant moving made it hard for him to form lasting friendships, an issue that continued into his adult life. Despite his struggles with socializing, Robert found a way to connect with others online, where he felt more comfortable. He loved chatting in online forums and meeting people without the pressure of face-to-face interaction. It was actually in one of these chat rooms that he met his first wife, a Canadian woman who was studying to become a teacher. They married in 2013, and Robert moved to Canada to be with her. They had a son together, but unfortunately, the marriage didn't last, and by 2017, they had separated. Robert's ex-wife received full custody of their son, with Robert only having supervised visitation. Although Robert and his ex-wife were no longer together, he stayed in Canada thanks to his permanent residency status, which he had earned through his job as a heavy goods vehicle mechanic. After his marriage ended, Robert, like Jasmine, turned to dating sites, where he dated several women before finally meeting Jasmine. Now, their whirlwind relationship began in September of 2018, and just a month later, Jasmine and her young daughter, Aaliyah, were moving into Robert's home. It was a bold step, one that raised eyebrows, especially with a child in the mix. Moving in after only 1 month of dating is fast by most standards, but for them, it seemed like the logical choice at the time. Financially, it made sense. Sharing a home meant cutting costs in half, something many people can appreciate in today's economy. Unlike a roommate setup, living with a partner offers more than just a practical split of rent. There's someone to help with groceries, chores, and in Jasmine's case, childcare. With no job at the time, Jasmine relied on child support from her ex while dedicating herself to raising Aaliyah. Having Robert step in to help with Aaliyah must have been a welcome relief. And help he did. Robert was more than eager to pitch in. Whether it was cooking, cleaning, or watching Aaliyah while Jasmine ran errands, he seemed to embrace his new role wholeheartedly. His love for Aaliyah was obvious. He treated her like his own, and for Jasmine, that made all the difference. From the outside, things looked perfect. Jasmine's family thought so too. She remained close to her mother and sister Janavi, frequently meeting them for family dinners. When Robert began joining these gatherings, her family welcomed him. He seemed kind, attentive, and genuinely invested in Jasmine and Aaliyah. But not everyone was entirely on board. Janavi, always protective of her sister, couldn't shake her unease. The relationship was moving too fast for her liking, and while Robert's care for Aaliyah and Jasmine was clear, Janavi couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. Then came April 14th, 2019. A family dinner like any other. Jasmine, Robert, and Aaliyah joined the usual gathering. But this time, something was off. Genevieve couldn't help but notice that Jasmine and Robert seemed distant, a little more reserved than usual. It was subtle, but enough to make her wonder. Still, the dinner ended without incident, and the sisters even made plans to meet again on Good Friday, April 19th. But when the day came, Jasmine never showed up. No call, no text, nothing. This was completely out of character. Jasmine was someone who always kept her commitments, especially with family. Genevieve's worry grew with every unanswered call and text. She even tried messaging Jasmine on Facebook, but her messages weren't just ignored. They were marked undelivered. Unable to shake her concern, Genevieve drove to Jasmine and Robert's house that evening around 5 p.m. The basement light was on, a sign that someone had to be home. She knocked on the door. No answer. She rang the doorbell. Still nothing. She waited, knocked again, and even tried peeking inside, but the house remained eerily silent. With no way to reach her sister, Genevieve left, hoping she was overthinking things. 2 days later, on April 21st, Jasmine's mother, Kim, decided to visit the house herself. Like Genevieve, she was met with silence. Knocking, ringing the doorbell, it was all futile. But as she prepared to leave, Kim noticed something strange near the front door. 2 pairs of sneakers. One pair was freshly cleaned, still soaking wet, and placed neatly by the entrance. Though her mother hadn't received any response, she left a note on the front door of Jasmine and Robert's home. It was probably a message urging them to get in touch, hoping that either Jasmine or Robert would finally respond. But the days went by, and still, there was no word from Jasmine. By April 23rd, 4 days after leaving the note, the family's concern had reached a boiling point. Jasmine had missed several planned check-ins, and on this day, she was supposed to meet her mother and sister for another family dinner. This dinner was a long-standing tradition for the family, and missing it was something Jasmine would never do. Despite the growing worry, the family still clung to a small thread of hope. Maybe something had come up, or maybe there was a misunderstanding. But as the hours ticked by and Jasmine didn't show up, that hope began to fade. This was the moment that everything shifted for Genevieve. She was beyond worried. The feeling that something was terribly wrong weighed heavily on her, and she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her gut. So, she decided to go to the police station and file a missing persons report. And she was determined to do whatever she could to help find her sister. She handed over her phone, answered every question the police had, and provided a full account of everything she knew about Jasmine's life in recent months. Initially, detectives considered the possibility that Jasmine had left voluntarily. However, Genevieve immediately dismissed the idea. Her sister would never abandon her family, especially not without contacting someone, least of all with her young daughter, Aaliyah, left behind. Jasmine was deeply devoted to her child and her family. Disappearing without a trace simply wasn't in her character. Investigators also turned their attention to Jasmine's ex, Robbie, wondering if he might be connected to her disappearance. Genevieve clarified that while Robbie was no longer involved in Jasmine's life, he had relinquished his parental rights to Aaliyah, which meant he was no longer obligated to pay child support. While this had added financial strain on Jasmine, there had been no indications of lingering conflict between them. After investigating further, police ruled him out as a suspect. However, when the detectives began looking deeper into Jasmine's relationship with her current partner, Robert, they found themselves uncovering a much more complicated situation than they had initially imagined. So, back in December of 2018, Jasmine had confided in her sister, Genevieve, about the troubles she was facing with Robert. Their relationship was strained, and they had actually broken up. However, they decided to continue living under the same roof as roommates. It was an unusual arrangement, especially considering there's a toddler in the house. But Jasmine explained it as a practical decision. Moving out with a toddler is not only difficult, but also costly. She justified it as a temporary solution, hoping they could figure things out. And just a few weeks later, Jasmine told Genevieve that they had reconciled and decided to give their relationship another shot. However, the troubles didn't end there. Jasmine revealed another personal detail to her sister that added yet another layer of complexity to the situation. during their period of separation, she had become pregnant. But instead of continuing with the pregnancy, Jasmine made the difficult decision to terminate it. The emotional weight of that choice seemed to linger, and it was unclear whether it played a role in the breakup, their reconciliation, or in something deeper that was affecting their relationship. As time went on, financial stress began to build. With Robbie no longer providing child support for Aaliyah, Jasmine found herself carrying the full burden of providing for both herself and her daughter. While she hadn't yet secured a job, she was determined to find work. In fact, Jasmine longed to return to the workforce, not just for financial reasons, but also to feel productive and to have more interaction with other adults. She even admitted to feeling jealous when Robert left for work each day, while she stayed behind to care for Aaliyah. Now, Genevieve's account convinced detectives that this was no runaway case. Something else had happened to Jasmine, and the police wasted no time launching a full-scale investigation. Within days, they pieced together a timeline of events leading up to her disappearance. As mentioned earlier, Jasmine and her daughter Aaliyah were last seen at a family dinner on April 14th, and everything seemed perfectly normal. On April 15th, CCTV footage captured them at a local grocery store. Jasmine appeared calm and collected as she paid for her groceries at a self-checkout, with Aaliyah peacefully nestled in her stroller. The following day, April 16th, was when the first hint of something troubling began to unfold. Robert dropped Aaliyah off at daycare at precisely 7:12 in the morning. Everything appeared fine as usual, but things took a strange twist later in the day. At 4:46 p.m., Robert returned to pick up Aaliyah, but there was a problem. He wasn't on the authorized pickup list. This wasn't a small detail. In order to take Aaliyah home, Robert had to call Jasmine, who then had to personally authorize the daycare staff to release Aaliyah into his care. Now, while this was certainly unusual, it wasn't the most alarming part. What happened after that was Jasmine and Aaliyah would never be seen or heard from again. Days went by without a trace. Then on April 18th, an odd clue surfaced. Jasmine's credit card was used to place a food delivery order, but the authorities couldn't confirm whether Jasmine herself had placed the order or if someone else had gained access to her card, but it was clear that whoever had used it was still connected to her in some way. By now, the focus of the investigation had shifted to Robert. After all, he had been the last person seen with both Jasmine and Aaliyah. Genevieve, Jasmine's sister, had already told the authorities about the tension in Jasmine and Robert's relationship, their breakup, their reconciliation, and the strain they were under. This information made Robert an even more important person of interest. It seemed fair to question him, especially considering all the recent turmoil in their relationship. So, on April 24th, the police decided it was time for a welfare check at Robert's home. What happened next was strange and unsettling. The officers knocked on the door, but no one answered. They knocked again. And again. It was like a game of Groundhog Day, repeated knocks, but still no response. Then, the officers noticed something strange. The note that Jasmine's mother had left on the door just days earlier was still there. It was almost as if it had been waiting for them. But that wasn't the only odd detail. The front door's window, which had previously been clear, was now covered with something that looked like cellophane, the kind of clear plastic used to wrap gifts. It was the only window on the door that was covered, and it completely obstructed the view into the house. This made it impossible to see what was happening inside. The officers kept knocking, rang the doorbell, and waited. The atmosphere was tense, like something was being hidden. While waiting, one officer noticed a wet trunk liner lying over the air conditioner, seemingly drying out. It was obvious the trunk liner had been recently cleaned. In addition, the garden hose had been unwound, which suggested it had been used to rinse something down, likely the trunk liner. This observation immediately brought to mind the sneakers Jasmine's mother had seen earlier, which had been soaked and washed. A lot of signs were pointing to a cleanup, but what was being hidden? Then, As they continued to observe, they realized something. This house hadn't been abandoned. Someone had been there, cleaning and moving things around. The only problem was that the police couldn't get inside just for a welfare check. The locked door and the covered windows left them with no easy way in. But the officers weren't ready to give up. They decided to get creative and called the fire department. With the help of a ladder truck, they managed to peer into the windows of the upper floors, hoping to catch a glimpse of something that could give them more information. Unfortunately, they saw nothing through the windows. But as soon as the fire truck arrived, the lights inside the house flickered on, and moments later, Robert opened the front door. Of course, the officers questioned him, and his response? Well, take a look at this.
I was sleeping. I sleep with plugs in and... Hey, but we've been here for hours and hours and hours now, hey? Banging on your door and... Ringing on the doorbell. Calling your phone. Again. I've been drinking and smoking a lot, so... Okay. Okay, so... She's not with her sister. What do you mean? Well, that's the reason that we're here. Why do you think we're here? Is that the family's calling us, saying we haven't heard from our daughter and our sister. Yeah, it makes sense. Okay, that makes sense? Yeah. Okay, why does that make sense? Because I haven't heard from her either.
At this point, the officers knew they needed to dig deeper. They asked Robert about Jasmine's car, and he explained that she didn't drive. That seemed odd, considering she was a grown adult and should have some means of transportation. They also noticed the note on the door that Jasmine's mother had left behind, but Robert claimed he had no idea about it. The situation was becoming more bizarre with each passing moment. The officers were growing increasingly suspicious of Robert's behavior. His responses were erratic, and his story didn't seem to add up. As they pressed him for more details, it felt like Robert was either hiding something important or just completely out of touch with reality. So, determined to get to the bottom of things, the officers decided to take a closer look at Robert's past. As it turns out, Robert had a record of emotional abuse in his previous relationship. His ex-wife had reported that he would gaslight her, call her crazy, and emotionally mistreat her. It seemed that Robert's neglect and verbal mistreatment were a big part of what led to their divorce. But it didn't stop there. His ex-wife also reported that Robert had a growing collection of guns and knives, which alarmed her to the point that she feared for her safety and the safety of their child. The officers dug even further into Robert's history and found that his ex had also reported him for animal mistreatment. Apparently, Robert had taken the dog they once owned together to a park, tied it to a tree without food or water, and left it there. Thankfully, someone at the park noticed the dog and brought it to the Humane Society. Now, this was a huge red flag. Anyone who is cruel to an animal is likely to become cruel to humans too, and Robert's actions toward animals raised serious concerns. He was charged with animal abuse and pled guilty to 3 charges: causing an animal to be in distress, failing to provide an animal with food and water, and failing to provide an animal with shelter. While he didn't serve jail time, he was slapped with a hefty fine of $5,000 and was banned from owning animals for 10 years. But Robert's troubling history doesn't stop there. During the divorce hearings, Robert's ex-wife uncovered some seriously disturbing stuff. She found some chilling internet searches on Robert's phone. One was about chaining a dog to a tree, which, considering his history, definitely set off alarm bells. But the next search, it was even worse. It was about a mother and child dying in a house fire. Just imagine how terrified his ex must have felt. After what he'd already done to that dog, she couldn't help but fear that he might do something much worse to her and her son. With all this terrifying new info about Robert's past, the police decided it was time to get serious. On April 25th, they arrested him in connection with the disappearances of Jasmine and Aaliyah and brought him in for a formal interrogation. When asked about the last time he saw Jasmine and Aaliyah, Robert said that on April 17th, they had gone on a picnic at Bragg Creek, about 30 minutes from his home. Afterward, they all returned to the house, According to Robert, Jasmine sat on the couch watching TV while he got ready for a date. Keep in mind, Robert had been telling people that he and Jasmine were just roommates at this point, and he even claimed he'd been seeing another woman for quite some time. Robert went on to say everything seemed perfectly fine with Jasmine before he left for his date, but when he came back that night, Jasmine and Aaliyah were nowhere to be found. This raised some serious red flags for the investigators, especially since Jasmine's family had told them that Robert and Jasmine were in a serious relationship after their breakup. The officers decided to reach out to the woman Robert said he was dating that night, a woman we'll call Kate. When they spoke with her, Kate confirmed she had indeed been with Robert on the night Jasmine and Aaliyah disappeared. The police dug deeper, asking Kate some follow-up questions. She revealed that she and Robert had met online in February of 2019, roughly 5 months after Jasmine and Aaliyah had moved in with him. They'd gone on some dates, and Robert occasionally stayed at Kate's house. It didn't seem like he was trying to hide the relationship, but here's the kicker. Kate told the police she had never been to Robert's place. Every time she asked why, he claimed his room was messy and that he had a roommate. He even referred to Jasmine as his tenant, not his girlfriend. But as strange as all of this was, the police couldn't just jump to conclusions. Even though they were suspicious, they didn't have enough to tie him directly to Jasmine and Aaliyah's disappearance. So, Robert was released, but not without a few conditions. His car and phone were seized, and they obtained a search warrant for his townhouse. They told him he couldn't go home until they were done investigating. Over the next few days, the police combed through everything. They looked into Robert's phone data and uncovered that. On April 23rd, the day Jasmine and Aaliyah were reported missing, Robert had deleted around 30 photos of the two of them. He'd also deleted some photos of a gun. And, to make matters worse, his phone's location data showed he had been in the Bragg Creek area at the time Jasmine and Aaliyah went missing. Remember, he had claimed they went there for a picnic, but the timing was very suspicious. So, the police decided they needed to check out this creek area. When they searched it, they discovered a makeshift fire pit that looked freshly used, but not for cooking hot dogs or s'mores. As they examined the area, they found some truly disturbing items: a car seat belt, toddler shoes, diapers, parts of children's books, and a Jungle Book DVD. Scent dogs were brought in, and they alerted to the presence of an accelerant used to start the fire. The investigation didn't stop there. CCTV footage from a local gas station showed Robert filling up his car and a gas can, followed by him going through a car wash. But it was what they found when they searched his home that was even stranger. The front door had been barricaded with 2 long poles, and as mentioned earlier, the window was covered in cellophane. Multiple spots on the walls had also been sanded down and cleaned. Inside, they found more oddities: a plastic hammer filled with sand and boxes of blue moving blankets. They also found a gun safe, packed with multiple guns and boxes of ammo. But what stood out most was a partially melted firearm part, infant toys, Jasmine's prescription bottles, and even her shredded passport in his trash can. But wait, there was something even stranger. They found raw strips of bacon scattered all over the house, thrown about like it was some sort of bizarre breadcrumb trail. One piece of raw bacon was found draped over a dining room chair, another in the garage, and yet another in the room with the furnace. As if that wasn't strange enough, an empty bacon package was sitting idly in the kitchen. But despite all the bizarre findings, there was still no sign of Jasmine or Aaliyah. Now, while all of this was unfolding, Robert himself was out there giving interviews, adamantly claiming that he had nothing to do with Jasmine and Aaliyah's disappearance.
You were kind of the primary suspect in this homicide
I still
investigation. You still are. What are your thoughts about that, and what are your emotions right now? What's kind of going through your head?
It's very stressful, but I hope they will be found, and I hope we can move forward from this. No, we were friends, absolutely friends, and supported each other. I would like, obviously, for them to be found, and for me to be cleared of this.
Your relationship with Jasmine?
Good.
I mean, were you a boyfriend, girlfriend, or?
No, just good friends. Nothing alarmed me until, of course, I got arrested. So.
What happens with you right now?
I'm just gonna wait until I get a phone call to say that I can go home.
How are you feeling throughout all of this?
Traumatized, of course.
Is there anything else that you want to add to all this?
Yeah, if anyone sees her or Aaliyah, Jasmine or Aaliyah, please, let the authorities know. They said that they would be done with the property today, and that I would be able to go back to the property. But
So you're hoping to sleep there tonight?
I hope to sleep somewhere tonight. Yes.
As you might have seen in the video, Robert appeared to be high or possibly intoxicated. According to him, that had been his life for the past few days. He claimed everyone thought he was a kidnapper or murderer, and as a result, he had lost his job, his friends had turned on him, and he had nothing to do but drink every day. He also complained bitterly about the police, saying they had destroyed his house and made a huge mess. Robert insisted that he was innocent and hired a lawyer, convinced that he needed help to prove it. But then, someone close to him came forward anonymously, revealing that Robert had a reputation for being a loose cannon and behaving erratically. Investigators believed this new information, as it fit the pattern of strange interactions they'd already had with him. It was yet another piece of the puzzle that made him look increasingly suspicious. Still, there wasn't enough evidence to press charges. So, the police decided to try a new strategy. On May 5th, 2 undercover officers approached Robert on the street near his home. Remember, Robert had been talking a lot about how his life was falling apart, how he had lost his job, his friends, and had no one to turn to. It seemed like this was exactly what the police were hoping for, because as soon as the officers started talking to him, Robert began to open up. The undercover officers kept complimenting him and boosting his ego, telling him they believed he was innocent. This flattery seemed to have an impact on Robert, making him more willing to talk to them. At one point during their conversation, the officers even told Robert a false story. They claimed that while the police were investigating his house, one of his neighbors had stolen evidence from the scene and given it to them. This wasn't true at all, but they hoped it would make Robert trust them more. They kept manipulating him by suggesting that he meet them for a beer where they could talk about destroying the evidence together. Robert, clearly feeling lonely and vulnerable, agreed to meet up with them. But even though he seemed to be opening up, he was still a bit suspicious of the officers. He even asked them multiple times if they were really cops or if they were just trying to trick him. The undercover officers reassured him each time, convincing him that they weren't law enforcement. The officers continued their act, telling Robert crazy stories about how they were part of a criminal group, a gang with a lot of experience in illegal activities. They painted a picture of how bad the police were and how much they could help Robert. They even gave him advice on how to stop the cops from suspecting him, all while playing into his insecurities and fears. Eventually, the officers invited Robert to their so-called warehouse, which they made sound like some kind of secret hideout where they kept all their illegal weapons. Robert, desperate for someone to talk to and willing to take any support he could get, agreed to go with them. When they arrived at the warehouse, the officers showed him a collection of guns, hoping to make Robert believe that they were dangerous criminals. Seeing the weapons seemed to trigger something in Robert. He began to feel like he could trust these people who had been feeding him all these stories. So he started opening up more. He told them that when he and Jasmine were dating, he had cheated on her. He justified it by saying, "Every single guy does that." While this is clearly not true for everyone, it gave the officers even more insight into his mindset and character. According to Robert, Jasmine had wanted to get married, but he didn't, and this caused a lot of tension between them. As the conversation continued, Robert opened up even more. Despite only meeting these 2 officers 5 hours earlier, he confessed in detail, almost as if he was seeking validation or sympathy. He didn't clearly explain how he had killed Jasmine or her daughter Aaliyah, but he did share disturbing details. After killing them, Robert used his phone to find a remote area to dispose of their bodies. He chose Bragg Creek and drove there to check out the surroundings. He said he waited until the next day to hide the bodies, taking them to the woods near Bragg Creek. Once there, he buried them and drenched them in gasoline, although he didn't burn their bodies. His hope was that the smell of gasoline would confuse the cadaver dogs and prevent them from finding the remains. Robert's efforts to cover his tracks didn't stop there. He told the officers that he had also set up a makeshift fire pit to burn Jasmine and Elias's personal belongings. Items like Elias's car seat and other possessions were burned, all to make it look like Jasmine had simply taken her child and run away. Robert even went to the extent of covering the bodies in mulch because he believed the mulch would help mask the scent and confuse the cadaver dogs further. What struck the officers most was Robert's obsession with throwing off the cadaver dogs. He had bacon all over his house, and it wasn't just because he liked the smell of the meat. Robert explained that he had heard pork smells similar to human flesh, so he figured that the bacon would distract the dogs, preventing them from detecting the bodies. His plan seemed well thought out, almost like he had studied how to evade detection. He even commented on his old car, joking that if it had been a newer model, the police could easily track his movements. But since it wasn't, he felt like he had outsmarted them. And get this, Robert agreed to show the officers where he had hidden the bodies. So in the middle of the night, they drove to Bragg Creek, and Robert led them to the exact spot where he had buried Jasmine and Elias. The bodies were wrapped in blue moving blankets, buried under dirt, sticks, and mulch, not far from the makeshift fire pit. The fact that Robert brought the officers to the scene was chilling, as it showed just how proud he was of his actions. Many killers return to the scene of their crimes or keep mementos, and Robert seemed to take pleasure in showing off what he had done. The information Robert provided was more than enough for the police to arrest him immediately. The Calgary Police Department held a press conference soon after, but they didn't disclose all the details right away. DNA evidence confirmed the worst. The bodies found were those of Jasmine and her young daughter, Aaliyah. Jasmine had suffered brutal blunt force trauma to her head, with the added horror of a bullet wound behind her left ear. Aaliyah, too, endured savage blows, one to each side of her head, another to her back, and a spinal injury that made the fall theory impossible. Both deaths were ruled homicides, giving the authorities the green light to pursue murder charges, no longer just manslaughter. On the 7th of May, Robert's fate took a darker turn as he was officially charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. While the prosecution briefly considered pushing for first-degree murder charges, they ultimately concluded they couldn't prove premeditation. But they were confident. Second-degree murder would be their focus, and they aimed for a solid conviction. As his trial unfolded in October of 2021, Robert's defense took an unexpected turn. He pled guilty to the murder of Jasmine but insisted, almost callously, that he had nothing to do with Aaliyah's death. Robert's defense team painted a chilling picture of what they claimed happened on April 17th. They argued that Robert had picked up Aaliyah from daycare and brought her home to an empty house. Jasmine was nowhere to be found. He and Aaliyah played together, watching her favorite show, The Wiggles. At some point, she wandered upstairs toward the kitchen, but tragically, she slipped and fell backward, hitting her head. Robert claimed she got up quickly, appearing fine. So they continued their evening, eating dinner and watching TV. Later, Robert put Aaliyah to bed, went outside to smoke a cigarette, and made himself a drink. Jasmine came home around 7 o'clock, and at about 9 o'clock she went upstairs to check on Aaliyah. What she found was every mother's nightmare. Her daughter wasn't breathing and was unresponsive in her bed. According to Robert, Jasmine immediately flew into a rage, accusing him of killing Aaliyah. But that accusation set Robert off. In a fit of anger, he said he grabbed a hammer and struck Jasmine repeatedly until she collapsed. To make sure she was truly dead, He then retrieved a gun and shot her. The story only worsened from there. Robert, in a macabre attempt to cover his tracks, wrapped Jasmine's lifeless body in a blue moving blanket, then used a towel to clean up the blood. He tossed the towels away, made himself another drink, and went to bed. Over the next several days, he buried their bodies and burned anything that might have tied him to the crime. However, the autopsy told a much darker story. The injuries to Aaliyah's head and spinal cord were far more severe than any fall could explain. The evidence was too clear. This wasn't an accident. Additionally, medical examiners claimed that Aaliyah had injuries to her genital area, suggesting possible harm in that part. This revelation led prosecutors to believe that when Jasmine returned home on April 17th, she caught Robert in the act. Fearing that Jasmine might expose what she had discovered, Robert reportedly killed her to silence her. In a panic, he then killed Aaliyah, fabricating the story about her accidental fall down the stairs to cover his tracks. This theory seemed to align with what Jasmine's family had said about Robert's behavior, how he doted on Aaliyah, picking her up, cooking for her, and spending time with her in a way that raised suspicions. Although many might argue that a good step-parent can show care for a child, Robert's excessive interest, especially in light of the medical examiner's findings, seemed more than just ordinary affection. What's particularly striking is that Robert never denied killing Aaliyah during his conversations with undercover cops. Instead, he framed it as an accident. Prosecutors argued that had Aaliyah's death been truly accidental, Robert would have been eager to make that clear, especially considering how horrific the idea of killing a child is. In court, they pointed out that Robert never once said that he didn't kill her. Instead, he stuck with the story he had told from the beginning. Robert himself took the stand as the sole witness for his defense, repeating the same account. Aaliyah had fallen down the stairs, hit her head, and died in her sleep. But his excuse didn't hold up, especially when it came to the claim that he couldn't call for help because he couldn't find his phone. In reality, Robert had his phone with him the entire time. Plus, authorities were able to track his text messages, including one sent to his mistress just before the killings. Despite these inconsistencies, Robert waived his right to a jury trial, allowing the judge to decide his fate. The judge found him guilty of second-degree murder in Aaliyah's death, stating that the injuries were not accidental and that Robert had intentionally caused harm. The judge also pointed out that Robert's actions, drinking and smoking after the murders instead of seeking help for Aaliyah, showed a clear lack of remorse. Robert was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 22 years. Jasmine's family was satisfied with the sentence, though they acknowledged that no amount of time would bring Jasmine and Aaliyah back. The family also found solace in knowing that their loved ones' legacies would live on through their charitable efforts. They raised $25,000 for the Calgary Women's Emergency Shelter and started a memorial scholarship in Jasmine's name to help other women who have survived domestic violence. In 2022, Robert appealed his conviction, arguing that the medical examiner couldn't rule out an accidental fall causing Aaliyah's fatal injuries. However, the appeal was rejected, and on July 23, 2024, his conviction was upheld. As for Jasmine and Aaliyah's families, they continue to honor their memories by raising awareness about domestic violence and supporting those affected. But many people felt that the sentence wasn't enough. With only 20 years and the possibility of parole, some believed it was too lenient, given the brutal and calculated way he took their lives. It definitely sparked a lot of debate. So, what do you think? Was the punishment fair considering the severity of the crimes, or do you think he deserved a harsher sentence? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, so make sure to drop a comment below and let's talk about it. They say the devil doesn't make you do it. He just points out how easy it is to step over the edge. And that's exactly what happened in the early hours of August 15, 1967. It was the day Canada witnessed one of its most chilling, most tragic, random mass murders, leaving 9 innocent souls lost forever. Victor Hoffman, a troubled young man fresh out of a mental hospital, was desperate to avoid going back. Back in the 1960s, mental health care was far from what it is today. It was underfunded, misunderstood, and often stigmatized. So Victor made himself a promise. He wouldn't return to that place. And oh boy, he kept that promise. But in a way so chilling it lingers in your mind long after you hear the story. But before we dive into the dark heart of it all, let's take a step back and understand Victor's childhood and what led him to that mental facility in the first place. Born in 1946, Victor grew up in what seemed like a typical hard-working family. His parents, Robert and Stella Hoffman, were devout Lutherans living in the small village of Liask, Canada. The Hoffmans were known for their dedication to farming, their faith, and keeping Sundays sacred. They were the kind of family people would describe as ordinary and God-fearing. Victor was the fifth of 7 children in the Hoffman household. As a boy, he didn't stand out much from his siblings. His parents described him as a diligent, responsible child who hit all the usual milestones. By all accounts, he was a solid worker on the family farm and had a natural knack for hunting. He loved guns and spent a lot of time honing his skills as a hunter. However, there was one thing about Victor that set him apart. He was a loner. He didn't have friends and struggled in school, largely because he couldn't concentrate. Still, his parents didn't think much of it at the time. To them, Victor was just a quiet, independent kid. However, Victor later told psychiatrists that his struggles began when he was just 6 years old. That was the first time he saw the devil. He described the figure vividly, a towering black creature, 6 feet tall, with a long tail. From that moment, he felt torn between 2 forces, God and Satan, each trying to claim him. The battle within Victor's mind was relentless. He often woke up in the middle of the night to strange tapping sounds that would grow louder and faster. By the time he turned 10, these experiences had grown darker. Victor began having violent impulses, urges to kill that consumed his thoughts daily. He fantasized about harming his family and even strangers he had just met. But Victor kept his disturbing thoughts to himself, hiding them from his parents and siblings. To cope, he directed his violent tendencies toward animals. Killing animals gave him a sense of relief, even happiness, which he likened to the satisfaction a hunter feels after a successful kill. The devil, however, never left Victor alone. One morning while eating breakfast, he heard a voice calling out to him. Following the voice outside, he claimed to have encountered Satan again, this time in an even more grotesque form, a 6'6" man, weighing over 300 pounds, with the face of a pig. The devil promised Victor wealth and power in exchange for his soul. Though Victor claimed he didn't want to make a deal, he admitted to kneeling on one knee, hoping to at least become half as rich. But nothing came of it. Now, these encounters with the devil only deepened his already fragile mental state. He also claimed to see cold, dismembered hands floating in his room, and worse, he could feel them touch him. The devil's visits became a regular occurrence, with the dark figure relentlessly approaching Victor, asking for his soul. But no matter how many times the devil came, Victor refused to give in. Not long after these visits started, Victor allegedly began seeing angels. Unlike the devil, these angels appeared less frequently. According to Victor, they looked like human women, dressed elegantly, and their main goal was to guide him away from the devil's grasp. Victor believed they were messengers of God, sent to protect him and keep him on the right path. One day, Victor claimed he received a divine message. The angels and God themselves had tasked him with an extraordinary mission. If he could capture and destroy the devil, they promised to take him to heaven. This message consumed Victor. It gave him a sense of purpose, though it only made his behavior more erratic. Determined to fulfill this divine task, Victor tried everything he could think of to trap the devil. He started with nets, but those plans didn't work. Frustrated, he came up with a new plan. He'd shoot the devil down. On May 27, 1966, Victor's mother Stella found him outside in their backyard, firing his rifle into the sky. By the time she got there, he had already fired 3 rounds. Confused and understandably scared, Stella demanded to know what he was doing. His answer was chilling yet simple. "I shot the devil." Stella begged him to stop and managed to coax him back inside the house. Victor reluctantly put the rifle down, but then grabbed the family car and drove off. While he was gone, Stella and the rest of the family scrambled to hide every gun in the house. When Victor returned, he asked for the guns back, promising no harm would come to anyone. But his family refused. Agitated, he left again, only to come back shortly after, this time asking to speak with their pastor. The pastor arrived, and the two had a private conversation. Stella couldn't hear much of what was said, but when they stepped outside to finish their talk, she heard Victor say something that shook her to her core. "I'd like to kill my mom." That was it. Stella and her husband, Robert, knew they couldn't wait any longer. The next day, they made arrangements to have Victor admitted to Saskatchewan Hospital. Back in 1967, Saskatchewan Hospital was a big mental health facility located in North Battleford, Saskatchewan, Canada. At that time, mental health care wasn't as advanced as it is now. Hospitals like Saskatchewan were more like institutions, where patients were often locked away and given basic care. The focus wasn't really on helping people get better or recover. Patients were more or less kept in check. Treatments were mainly about managing symptoms with medication, and there wasn't much emphasis on understanding or treating the root causes of their conditions. Now, when Victor underwent his initial psychiatric evaluation, the attending doctor officially diagnosed him with schizophrenia. The severity of his condition left no room for debate. Victor needed to be hospitalized. Surprisingly, he didn't resist. He voluntarily agreed to commit himself, perhaps believing it was the best option for everyone, including himself. According to the records, he wasn't just battling a serious mental illness. His body was also showing signs of stress. He'd often be found talking to himself, laughing at nothing, and deep in confusion about his own identity. At one point, he even questioned whether he was a boy or a girl, adding to the chaos in his mind. He was cooperative with the doctors during his exams, but came across as withdrawn, vague, and indifferent. It seemed like Victor felt like an outsider in his own family, as they just couldn't understand what he was going through. He mentioned to his siblings that he saw the devil, but they just mocked him, laughing off his concerns. Victor wasn't just imagining things, though. He believed the devil was punishing him because he refused to sell his soul. At one point, he even thought that someone else's brain was inside his body. He claimed the brain belonged to a girl named Janice, and she wanted to take full control of him. His doctors explained all of this as mere illusions, but Victor was convinced otherwise. He felt like he had touched both the devil and angels, so he wasn't ready to let go of his beliefs. But as time went on, Victor realized that if he kept insisting that he was seeing the devil, he'd never get out of the hospital. So, he tried to convince himself that it was all in his head. He wanted to get better, to live a life without fear, and to leave the constant anxiety behind. The doctors started him on a treatment plan that included electroconvulsive therapy, 12 sessions in total, tranquilizers, occupational therapy, and supportive psychotherapy. By the end of his treatment, doctors believed that Victor had come to terms with the idea that all the devil sightings were just figments of his imagination. Victor seemed to buy into this too, as he no longer feared the devil and his mind appeared clearer than ever before. He was happy and cooperative, though still somewhat withdrawn and inclined to be alone at times. But here's the catch. Even though Victor was no longer scared of the devil, his darker impulses didn't go away. He still had violent thoughts, imagining killing his family and people around him for no reason other than the simple desire to do so. He openly shared these impulses with his doctors, and they were aware of them. Despite this, they were optimistic about his recovery. They told his father that he would be fine in a year or two, with some more therapy. So, despite knowing about Victor's dangerous impulses, the doctors discharged him from the hospital on July 26, 1967. They sent him back home to his father, along with a prescription for tranquilizers, hoping that this would keep him calm and prevent any further dangerous behavior. But life at home didn't exactly go as planned. Victor had a tough time adjusting back to life on the farm. He was surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of home, but something felt wrong. His mind was still clouded, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the world wasn't the same as it had been before his hospitalization. The medication prescribed to him didn't help much either. In fact, it made things worse. The tranquilizers made him feel incredibly sleepy, which interfered with his work on the farm. On top of that, his back hurt constantly, adding to his growing frustration. By August 8th, Victor had had enough of the medication. He complained that the tranquilizers made him feel weak and useless, and he desperately wanted to get back to his normal routine. He needed to feel strong again, especially to be able to help on the farm. So he made a choice. He stopped taking the pills. At first, he didn't notice any drastic changes, but a few days later, something shifted within him. On August 11th, Victor woke up with an unsettling feeling. It wasn't like the usual emotions he felt on a bad day. This was different. He had a strong sense that something was about to happen, but he couldn't explain why. All he knew was that he felt like he would either end up back in the hospital or in jail. Victor's biggest fear was going back to the hospital. The idea of being locked away again terrified him, and he said he'd rather die than face that fate. In his mind, he had been suffering for so long, and the hospital was just a place where people didn't understand him. He believed that the worst part wasn't the treatments or the isolation, it was being trapped in a place where no one could see what was really going on inside his mind. Victor had always felt different, and he began to believe that he had a special ability. He called it visions. These weren't just regular dreams or daydreams, though. According to Victor, these visions were a way of seeing the future. He believed that these premonitions had been happening for as long as he could remember, and they would come to him every day. And with each vision, there was always the same unsettling feeling. After seeing the future, he would imagine killing someone. It was as if this act would somehow prove to the devil that he was finally on his side, that he wasn't afraid to do whatever it took. On August 14th, Victor's day started off pretty normally. He spent the day working on the tractor, trying to keep himself busy and occupied. But by 9:30 p.m., he was exhausted. He fell asleep on the sofa, but around 11:30 p.m., his parents woke him up and asked him to go to his bedroom. He went back to sleep but woke up again around 3 a.m., unable to rest any longer. It was then that he decided to go to the garage and try to distract himself with some work. But after working for a while, he still couldn't shake the feeling of restlessness. So he began pacing back and forth in the garage, letting his mind wander. That's when something strange happened. As Victor stood by the garage door, he suddenly felt a strange sensation in the side of his head. It wasn't painful, more like a sudden rush of pleasure. He described it as if his body had been sliced in half and something had left him. It wasn't a feeling of pain, but more like release. It was as if all the tension and fear he had been holding on to suddenly vanished. But in its place, the urge to kill grew even stronger. The feeling surged through him, taking over his mind. With this new, overwhelming urge to kill, Victor decided he needed to do something about it. He grabbed his .22 Browning pump-action repeater rifle and loaded it up. He wasn't thinking clearly, but all he knew was that he needed to act. His plan was simple. He would drive around for about an hour, look for small rodents to hunt, and then head back home to finish his chores. He was looking for squirrels, particularly those living in the spruce trees around his farm. But as he drove for what felt like an eternity, he found no squirrels, no small animals at all. Victor could have taken that as a sign to turn around, but something inside him kept him going. The thought of killing wouldn't leave him. He couldn't ignore the pull to find something, someone, to take his frustration out on. He kept driving, passing house after house. It wasn't until around 6 a.m., when the sky was starting to brighten, that he came across a simple farmhouse. It didn't look any different from the dozens of other houses he had passed along the way, but for some reason, the feeling inside him became stronger. It was as if this place was calling to him. Unfortunately, the farmhouse where Victor ended up was home to the Peterson family, who lived in Shell Lake, about 40 miles away from Victor's place in Lesk. Unlike Victor's troubled life, the Peterson household was filled with joy and laughter. They were a big, close-knit family with 10 members in total. At the heart of the family was James Peterson, a hard-working, humble man who was all about community. After serving in World War II, James bought 328 acres of land and became a mixed grain and cattle farmer. But life wasn't easy, and when his father retired, James took on an additional 72 acres, making his workload even heavier. Back then in Canada, it wasn't uncommon for families to be large, and the Petersons were no different. They had 9 kids, ranging from the oldest, Kathy, who was 19, down to the youngest, Larry, who was just 1. The rest of the children were Jean, 17, Mary, 13, Dorothy, 11, Pearl, 9, Phyllis, 4, William, 5, and Colin, 2. The Peterson kids were known as well-behaved, polite, and liked by everyone around them. The whole family had a reputation for being good, respectable folks. They were an ordinary, church-going family, and honestly, no one had anything bad to say about them. Kathy was the only one who wasn't living at home at the time. She had recently gotten married and moved to British Columbia with her husband. The rest of the Petersons lived together in a modest, cozy farmhouse with just 4 rooms. Out of those, only 2 were used as bedrooms. The kids all slept together in one room, except for the 1-year-old baby, who shared a bed with James and Evelyn. It was crowded, but they made it work. They weren't rich by any means, but the Petersons never complained. They cherished what they had, especially their family. James and Evelyn were totally focused on their kids and built a home around them. They loved their children above all else and wanted the best for them. Their oldest daughter, Jean, was an up-and-coming athlete, and her parents were determined to support her talent. So, to help pay for a track camp she wanted to attend in Dundurn, James decided to call up his neighbor, Wildrew Lang. He needed help hauling 50 bushels of hay to the grain elevator to sell the next morning, on August 15, 1967. The very same day that Victor, at that moment, was feeling the uncontrollable urge to kill. According to interviews from his trial, the voices in Victor's head were loud and clear, telling him, "This is it. This is where you have to go and do it." Now, to his surprise, he allegedly recognized the kitchen, despite never having been there before or even knowing the Petersons. It felt so familiar, like he'd seen it in a dream before. Not long after entering, he was confronted by James Peterson, who, not knowing who Victor was or why he was there, lunged toward him, trying to protect his family. James fought back, but Victor was too fast. He shot James 7 times as he tried to shield his loved ones. Afterward, Victor went back outside to reload his gun and gather his thoughts. But as he stood there, he saw Evelyn, James's wife, climbing out of a window with their youngest son, Larry, in her arms. Without hesitation, he shot Evelyn and left her where she fell, motionless. Victor didn't stop there. He went back inside the house, where the Peterson children were still asleep in their beds. One by one, he shot and killed 6 of them, Jean, Mary, Dorothy, Pearl, William, and Colin, at close range while they lay defenseless. The children had no chance. He then returned to where Evelyn's lifeless body lay and took Larry's life as well. He later claimed it was a mercy killing, reasoning that the young boy was too little to survive alone. Victor's twisted reasoning didn't stop there. Since he'd already killed James, he felt there was no reason to leave anyone alive to identify him. So, he set about collecting as many spent cartridge cases as he could find, making sure there was nothing left behind that could tie him to the scene. After the horrific act, Victor made his way back to his own parents' house. He arrived around 7:30 in the morning, but instead of feeling any sense of relief, he was overcome with sickness and horror at what he had just done. The guilt weighed on him heavily as he spent the rest of the day wrestling with the reality of his actions. Meanwhile, Will Drew Lang arrived at the Peterson farm, expecting to see James, but James was nowhere to be found. It was getting close to 9 a.m., so Lang, assuming James had slept in, joked to the house, calling out for him. But when he pushed open the door, his casual tone quickly turned into one of shock. Inside, he found James Peterson's lifeless body sprawled on the kitchen floor. Horrified, Lang quickly backed away and rushed to his car. He drove to the nearest phone, a good 4 miles down the road, to make the call that would change everything. The peaceful morning in Shell Lake was shattered, and the Peterson family's lives, along with everyone in the surrounding area, would never be the same. When the police arrived at the Peterson farmhouse, they wasted no time. They rushed in, scanning the home for any survivors and clues that could help them understand what had happened. But the scene they found was chilling. There were no signs of a robbery, and everything appeared untouched. It seemed like there was no clear motive for the murders. Inside, they found 28 bullets, with 27 of them having hit their targets. It was clear that the killings were deliberate, not random. Boot prints were also discovered on the kitchen's linoleum floor, but oddly, no boots from the Peterson home matched the prints. Alongside that, 5 cartridge casings were found, confirming that a .22 caliber weapon had been used. Then, just as they were starting their investigation, something eerie happened. A muffled noise broke the silence. They traced the sound to one of the beds, where, hidden under the sheets and wedged between the bodies of her sisters, they found 4-year-old Phyllis. She was the only survivor of the horrifying massacre. At first, she didn't fully understand what had happened, but she could sense the severity of the situation. Later, she recalled how the officer who carried her from the house was crying. That was when she knew something truly terrible had taken place. Phyllis's survival was a miracle, and her story would haunt everyone who heard it. The massacre of the Peterson family became one of the most gruesome crime scenes many officers had ever witnessed. Phyllis was taken to her uncle's house nearby, while Kathy, her older sister, was notified of the tragedy. Devastated, Kathy moved back to Shell Lake to care for her surviving sister. As the police investigated, they combed through the tall grass and fields surrounding the farm, hoping to find something, anything, that might give them a lead. Roadblocks were set up, and the search for the killer expanded across the area, growing larger with each passing day. They spent days searching, with dogs and a search party of 250 people scouring the land, but nothing turned up. Then on the 4th day, they caught a break. A local resident from Liask, concerned about the tragedy, walked into the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Detachment office in Shellbrook. The resident suggested they look into a young man, the son of his neighbor, who had recently been discharged from a mental hospital. The man had a known obsession with guns and hunting, which immediately raised red flags. The corporal and his team didn't hesitate. They quickly got in their cars and drove down the narrow, winding highways toward Lesk, their destination, the farm owned by the Hoffman family. They had a hunch this might be the lead they were desperately looking for. They started by questioning Victor's parents, focusing specifically on any firearms, boots, and of course, their son. As the investigation went on, things started to add up. A rifle was found on the Hoffman's property, and although it wasn't the exact model they originally expected, it was still significant. The police had it sent for ballistics testing to see if it matched the bullets from the Peterson home. During the search, the detectives also spotted a pair of rubber boots. These boots were sent for comparison too, and when the results came back, it was clear. Both the rifle and the boots matched evidence found at the Peterson house. It wasn't long before they had enough evidence to make an arrest. Victor Hoffman was charged with the brutal murders of 9 members of the Peterson family. When the arrest was made, there was something chilling about Victor's demeanor. Described by police as a single average build man, he didn't seem afraid at all. In fact, he was eerily calm and surrendered without any resistance. His arrest happened just 3 hours after the funeral for the Petersons, adding a whole new layer of shock and horror to the case. Victor was taken to the station in North Battleford, and for the first 10 to 15 minutes, he was silent, not saying a word. But eventually, he broke down. What came next was even more disturbing. Victor confessed to everything. He admitted that the devil made him kill the Petersons. But perhaps the most unsettling part of his confession came when he was asked about Phyllis, the only survivor. Victor claimed that he spared Phyllis because she had the face of an angel. As for the others, he said he didn't respect them because they looked like pigs. These chilling responses raised serious concerns about Victor's mental state. So instead of being sent to a regular prison, he was taken to a nearby mental hospital for further evaluation. There, doctors diagnosed him once again with paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that had clearly gone untreated. Despite this, the court found that he was still fit to stand trial. Victor's trial began on January 8, 1968, and his charges were 2 counts of non-capital murder. The defense team argued that Victor wouldn't have committed the horrific crime if it hadn't been for his untreated mental illness. They stood firm, insisting that his condition played a central role in the tragedy. After deliberating for 3.5 hours, the jury reached a verdict. Despite the overwhelming evidence against Victor, the jury found him not guilty by reason of insanity. The decision stunned many and left people questioning how someone who had confessed to such a brutal crime could escape the full weight of justice. But the jury's decision was based on something that many hadn't expected at the time: Victor's mental health. The doctor who had testified for the defense had given such a detailed and logical explanation of Victor's mental illness that the jury felt convinced. They understood that Victor was driven by something that, in his mind, felt real. His paranoia and delusions had played a major role in what happened, and that convinced the jury that he truly believed he was doing what he thought was necessary. Although Victor wouldn't spend the rest of his life in prison, the judge made sure he didn't get off easy. Instead of a typical prison sentence, Victor was committed to an institution for the criminally insane. This seemed to hurt him even more. After hearing the verdict, he just sat there, looking straight ahead, showing absolutely no emotion. It was as if the reality of his situation hadn't hit him yet. Victor was sent to a facility in southern Ontario where he would stay indefinitely, with his release depending on government regulations. For years, he remained in that institution, out of the public eye, until December of 2001, when he was granted supervised access to nearby towns. But even this small amount of freedom didn't last long. Victor would never experience true freedom again. On May 21, 2004, Victor died in custody from cancer, but the aftermath of his crimes would linger for much longer. Kathy, the sister of one of the victims, took on the responsibility of raising Phyllis, the only survivor of the massacre. She raised Phyllis alongside her own children, giving her a second chance at life after the horrors she had experienced. Eventually, Kathy and her husband retired from farming and moved to a nearby town after their family farmhouse burned down. But despite the years that had passed, both Kathy and Phyllis couldn't shake their frustrations about what happened. Phyllis had been a little girl when the massacre occurred, and as she grew up, she still struggled with the shadow of the tragedy. She spoke about how difficult it was to live with the unwanted attention that came with being the only survivor. People looked at her differently, and it was hard to escape the weight of the past. In an interview in 2004, Phyllis opened up about her struggles. She said, "It was always hard to adjust, always feeling like I didn't fit in, until I had my son, James." Having James was a turning point for Phyllis. It helped her heal in ways she never thought possible. Sadly, Phyllis passed away from cancer in May of 2019. A Canadian journalist named Peter Tadman wrote a book titled The Shell Lake Massacre, where he covered the details of the case. In the book, Peter interviewed Victor several times, and he reported that Victor stood firm in his belief that he didn't feel any guilt for his actions. He even claimed that he still saw the devil who had compelled him to murder so many innocent people. To this day, the Peterson massacre remains one of Canada's most horrific random killings, second only to the Portapique massacre in 2020, where 22 innocent lives were taken. While the insanity ruling in Victor's case is something we can't ignore, it's definitely a tough one to digest. Just because someone is deemed insane doesn't mean their actions can be justified. No innocent life should ever be lost, no matter the circumstances. But let's be real. None of this would have happened if Victor hadn't been released from the mental hospital in the first place. So, what do you think? Was Victor truly a psychopath who somehow got loose, or do you think there's something else going on here? I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and let's talk about it. They say kindness is the best gift you can give, but what if that gift turns into your worst nightmare? That's exactly what happened when Janice posted this chilling status on Facebook, begging for help, saying she and her siblings were under attack. What no one knew at the time was that this cry for help would spark one of the most horrifying and shocking cases the Philippines had ever witnessed. The case was so disturbingly gruesome and eerily bizarre that it's compared to a famous movie. And by the time you reach the end of this video, you'll be questioning every act of kindness you've ever given, and just how horrifying it can be when it falls into the wrong hands. To really get the picture, let's head over to the small, quiet town of Malang in North Cotabato, Philippines. It's a place known for its calm vibe and rural charm, where life moves at a slower pace. People here are deeply connected to the land, relying on agriculture for their livelihood, growing staples like rice, corn, and vegetables. In this peaceful town lived the Maguad family. Unlike many others, they led a pretty stable life. Cruz Maguad, the father, was an elementary school teacher. He was well respected and loved by everyone, constantly being praised for his hard work. A promotion was even on the horizon, which meant he was doing pretty well financially. His wife, Lavella, was the principal at the same school. Together, they didn't make crazy money, but they were considered one of the more privileged families in town. Their youngest child, Louis, also known as Boy Boy, was 16. He dreamed of becoming a lawyer, even at his young age, and he was determined to work hard to get there. Aside from being smart, he was also creative, playing guitar, drawing, and reading in his spare time. Gwen, his older sister, was the more intense one. Super smart, driven, and goal-oriented, she had always been this way. As a kid, she was a Girl Scout, and her sash was covered in so many badges that there was no room for more. Gwen didn't just stop there. She enrolled in a pre-med prep program during high school and planned to become a doctor. By all accounts, Gwen was the type of person who would sit with you at a party if you were feeling shy, sticking by your side until you felt at ease. That's exactly how she met 17-year-old Janice. But unlike Gwen and Louis, Janice's childhood was far from happy. She wasn't privileged enough to attend school and had to work from a very young age. Even worse, she grew up without parents. Her first real memory started when she was around 8 years old. Before that, everything was a blur. She only remembers being found by a stranger, wandering alone on a huge shipping container boat. Her parents were nowhere to be found, and Janice believed they had abandoned her. The stranger was kind enough to post her picture and name online, trying to find her parents. They shared her story on Facebook and various online forums, but no one ever came forward. Eventually, Janice was dropped off at the Philippines version of CPS, the Department of Social Welfare and Development, where she moved from one foster home to another. Not long after, Janice was offered a live-in nanny job by a family. Though she hated the job, she was incredibly grateful for the opportunity. Janice shared all of this with Gwen, and Gwen was so deeply moved by her story that an idea began to form in her mind. An idea that could give Janice the safe, loving home she deserved: adoption. Gwen, together with Louis, decided to present the idea to their parents like a well-thought-out thesis. They approached the subject with serious dedication, telling their parents that adopting Janice wouldn't just change her life, it would help their family too. They convinced their parents that Janice could pitch in with the chores around the house, which was a big deal in their Asian family culture. It wasn't uncommon for children to share the responsibility of washing dishes, cleaning, and cooking. With one more set of hands to help, the family would run more smoothly. Gwen's parents weren't exactly rolling in money, but they believed in teaching responsibility. The kids had chores, had to keep their grades up, and attend church every Sunday. They were strict, but it was out of love, and Gwen and Louis respected that. That strong connection gave Gwen and Louis the courage to ask for something as big as adopting Janice. In 2021, Janice moved in, and it was like she was instantly part of the family. The Maguads welcomed her with open arms. Louis even gave up his own room just so Janice could have a more comfortable one. They enrolled her in school right away, and for the first time, Janice didn't wake up with the constant worry of finding food or going to work. She was finally allowed to be a kid. As Janice settled into her new life, the bond between the three siblings grew stronger by the day. You could see the happiness shining through, especially in the videos they posted on TikTok. Janice even got to experience a family vacation for the first time, something she had always dreamed of. Laughter filled the air as they explored new places together, creating memories she would cherish forever. For once, Janice felt like she belonged to something bigger, something safe, and full of love. But just when everything seemed perfect, Janice's world was about to shatter. On the 10th of December that same year, she posted a series of statuses on Facebook, claiming that she and her siblings were under attack. It was just days before Christmas, a time that should have been filled with joy. But instead, it was the beginning of a nightmare. At that time, Mr. Cruz, the father, was at school, doing some chores related to the upcoming holiday. Lavella, the mother, was away on a work trip. But everything changed when Mr. Cruz received a phone call that left him frozen in terror. The voice on the other end told him that their home was being ransacked, and his children were there. By 3:15 in the afternoon, Cruz finally arrived at the house. It was eerily silent. Outside the front door, his eyes locked onto a blood-soaked blanket on the ground, with a knife nearby. He called out for his kids, but there was no response. He moved quickly to the back door and managed to find a way inside. Cruz moved rapidly through the house, his voice echoing off the walls as he searched for his children. It wasn't until he entered the living room that his worst nightmare became a horrifying reality. There, lying on the floor, was his daughter Gwen. A towel soaked in blood was wrapped around her body. Her limbs and torso were covered in multiple slash wounds, but it was the injuries on her neck that were particularly severe. Crime scene photos later revealed the gruesome extent of the wounds. Her flesh was torn apart, and ants had already begun to gather on her body. Not far from Gwen, near the main door, Cruz found Louis. His hands and feet were bound, and a gag covered his mouth. His body was riddled with fresh stab wounds. The amount of blood suggested the attack had happened just moments before Cruz arrived. But there was one more person missing: Janice. Cruz's heart pounded as he continued to search the house, calling her name. Then, finally, Janice appeared. She emerged from her room, her hair wet, her face pale and shaken. She was in shock, barely able to speak. Seeing her, Cruz immediately called the police. The officers arrived soon after, stepping into a crime scene that would later be described as one of the most gruesome in the Philippines. Blood pooled on the floor, and the house bore the marks of extreme violence. Janice, while trembling, told the officers that they had been attacked. The house was in disarray. Cabinets had been pried open and personal belongings were scattered across the rooms. At first glance, it seemed like a robbery. However, investigators knew that appearances could be deceiving. They needed to confirm whether anything valuable had been taken to solidify the robbery theory. At the same time, as part of their protocol, the police didn't rule out the parents as persons of interest. They needed to confirm their alibis and whereabouts during the attack. The investigators turned their attention to the room where Janice said she was hiding during the attack. It was messy, but that wasn't unusual for a robbery scene. What stood out, though, were the details that didn't add up. The disarray in the room, though chaotic, didn't have the usual signs of a real robbery. So, the police began to search the house more carefully, and they soon found some crucial evidence. Just outside the front door, the police discovered a blood-stained shirt, which they believed had been dropped by the attacker while trying to escape. And about 100 meters away, they found a plastic bag in a ditch. Inside it were bloody pants and underwear. It seemed like the attacker had deliberately thrown these items away to hide evidence. Inside the house, the scene was increasingly horrifying. Near the front door, officers found a knife with a broken handle, its blade slick with blood. The living room floor was littered with shards of glass and broken bottles, a clear sign of the violence that had unfolded there. Expansive pools of blood painted a grim picture, revealing the brutal nature of the attack. Among the carnage, investigators discovered a discarded machete, a baseball bat, and a hammer, each stained with blood. These weapons were assumed to be used in the murders. Crime scene analysts took careful note of the blood patterns, which provided key insights into the sequence of events. They determined that Gwen, the older sibling, had likely been killed first. Her blood had partially coagulated, and rigor mortis had already begun to set in. In contrast, Lewis's blood appeared much fresher, suggesting he had been murdered shortly after Gwen. The different states of the blood and bodies made this theory even more plausible. Louis's hands and feet were bound, while Gwen's were not. This discrepancy indicated that Gwen might have been ambushed and killed quickly, while Lewis was restrained, likely to prevent him from resisting before his own murder. The variety of weapons found at the scene, ranging from a broken knife to a machete, baseball bat, and hammer, raised troubling questions for the investigative team. The fact that so many different tools were used, and that the victims had distinctive types of wounds, strongly suggested the involvement of more than one attacker. This theory was supported by the fact that Louis had been restrained. It would have been difficult for a single person to control a victim while also carrying out such a brutal attack. Adding to the mystery, Cruz, the sibling's father, confirmed that the weapons found at the scene were his. The murderers seemed to have used tools that were readily available in the house, which made the crime even more unsettling. As investigators continued to gather evidence, they found something that stood out. The family's laundry machine had been used, but there were no freshly washed clothes anywhere in the house. This odd discovery suggested that something unusual had happened after the crime, perhaps an attempt to erase evidence or cover their tracks. The extreme brutality of the crime prompted local authorities to launch a manhunt for the suspects. The public was shocked, and the need for justice became urgent. To help with the investigation, the vice of the Municipal Council of Malang, North Cotabato, announced a reward of 200,000 pesos for any information leading to the capture of the perpetrators. The mayor also offered an additional 50,000 pesos as a bounty. These actions emphasized the gravity of the case and the community's desperate need for answers. An autopsy was performed on Gwen and Lewis, spanning 2 days, starting on December 13, 2021, and the results were chilling. Gwen had sustained 32 stab and slash wounds, some of which were deep enough to almost sever her limbs. One of her ears had been cut off, and her neck and upper arm were nearly severed. Her body also showed signs of blunt force trauma, likely caused by the hammer and baseball bat found at the scene. Additionally, the backs of her hands were bruised and covered in defensive wounds, indicating that she had fought fiercely until the end. Meanwhile, Louis had endured 51 knife wounds, some so deep that they exposed his bone and internal organs. Red marks on his neck suggested he may have been strangled. Unlike his sister, Lewis had no defensive wounds, implying that he was caught off guard and unable to fight back. He also had signs of blunt force trauma on his limbs and torso. All these injuries were consistent with the weapons recovered at the scene. Investigators quickly ruled out the possibility of a robbery gone wrong. The scene had been staged. While the rooms appeared ransacked, only Gwen's phone was missing. Nothing else of value had been taken, leading authorities to believe that the killer or killers were familiar with the victims. It was also striking that the crime took place in broad daylight, which made the entire situation even more unsettling. Before the autopsy results were made public, rumors began circulating online, accusing Janice of being involved in the crime. These rumors gained traction due to her survival, the weapons being from the family home, and the locked front door. The accusations grew increasingly intense, with some even threatening Janice. Under the mounting pressure, the police decided to question her. Janice described the events of that day. She had been studying with Gwen in her bedroom while Louis was downstairs in the living room. Suddenly, they heard Louis screaming, and 3 men broke into the house. The 2 girls rushed downstairs and saw the 3 men attacking Louis with the weapons found at the scene. The attackers then turned on Gwen, and in fear, Janice fled upstairs, locked herself in the bedroom, and hid under the bed. She was too scared to call the cops, so instead, she texted the family group chat asking for help. Later, she messaged her adopted mom saying, "Mom, help." When no one saw those messages, Janice went a step further and posted on social media, saying, "Help! Somebody has broken into the house. I don't want to die. I'm hiding in my room. Help!" After a few minutes, she deleted the post, worried the attackers might see it and come after her. She tried calling her mom, but there was no answer. By the time someone saw the post and reached out to her mom, Janice was too scared to pick up. She went as far as changing her social media username and turning her phone to silent, clearly trying to hide. When the house finally fell silent, Janice emerged from her hiding place, too afraid to go downstairs. She claimed she took a shower and changed clothes to calm herself, finishing just as Cruz arrived home. But there was something odd about this part of the story. Janice had told the police she locked herself in her bedroom the second the attack started. So why did her room look like it had been ransacked? That raised some serious questions. More importantly, Janice's version of events was directly at odds with the forensic evidence. The autopsy results and the way the injuries were distributed made it clear that Gwen was the first victim, not Lewis. This major discrepancy between Janice's account and the evidence made investigators even more suspicious. Something wasn't adding up, and they started to take a closer look at Janice's statements. At first, she told the police her phone was off during the attack, but Cruz remembered calling her phone and hearing it ring with no answer. When Janice was confronted with this, she changed her story again, now claiming that she had been in the shower and hadn't heard her phone ringing. This was starting to sound fishy. In a case like this, who on earth could actually take a shower while their siblings were being attacked? It's just hard to wrap your head around, right? But that wasn't the only thing that raised eyebrows. Cruz also revealed some things about the murder weapons that added fuel to the fire. The baseball bat used in the attack originally belonged to Lewis. He had kept it in his room on the top bunk as a kind of protection. But after being adopted by Cruz, Janice had taken over the top bunk. The hammer used in the attack was another tool that Cruz kept around for home repairs. He was very careful about where he kept it, usually hiding it behind the washing machine. Cruz mentioned that only 3 people knew exactly where that hammer was: himself, Gwen, and Janice. This meant that the killer or killers had to have known the family's routines and possessions really well, almost like they had been living in the house with them. Things got even more suspicious when a delivery driver came forward. The driver had arrived at the house just 18 minutes before Cruz was contacted by a neighbor who noticed no one had answered the door. The driver kept calling out, hoping someone would respond. Eventually, he noticed a woman peering at him through a door before she suddenly walked away. The woman's identity was never confirmed, but it raised serious doubts about where Janice was and what she was doing during the crucial moments of the attack. Another key clue came from the front door. It had been locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry. This was a big deal because it meant that whoever had done this was probably someone who was familiar with the house, someone who had access to a key and could lock the door after the crime. At this point, it's pretty clear that Janice had something to do with the murders. However, since Janice was only 17 years old, still a minor under Philippine law, the police couldn't arrest her without solid proof. This legal issue made them tread carefully, as they couldn't move forward with an arrest until they had more definitive evidence. Instead of arresting her right away, the authorities placed Janice under the care of the Social Welfare Department, while the investigation turned to finding out who actually committed the murders. If Janice's claim about other people being involved was true, the police had a lot of work ahead of them. 5 days after the murders, a significant breakthrough occurred. The police discovered Janice's fingerprints on the murder weapons. This was a huge deal, but it wasn't the smoking gun. After all, Janice had lived in the house where the weapons were stored, so her prints could have been there simply from handling them. Still, it was a lead they couldn't ignore. To ensure she wasn't treated unfairly, Janice was given a lawyer by the Social Welfare Department. But things took another unexpected turn when Lavella, Janice's adoptive mother, found a contact tracing form while searching Janice's room for clues. The surprise? It wasn't Janice's form. It belonged to a 17-year-old boy named Esmeraldo Aldo Canedo Jr. Aldo was a sacristan at a local church, and Janice had known him from the orphanage. This discovery sent the police scrambling to figure out if Aldo had anything to do with the murders. And soon enough, witnesses came forward, confirming Aldo had been near the crime scene on the day of the killings. One woman said she saw Aldo drop Janice off near the house right before the murders, and another neighbor said she saw him asking for directions to the house that morning. When shown a picture of Aldo, the woman immediately recognized him. Then on December 16th, 6 days after the murder, Janice, with her lawyer present, gave a full confession. She admitted to being involved in the murders along with Aldo and her so-called 21-year-old boyfriend, who was unnamed. Janice explained that her motive was deep resentment and jealousy. She felt that Gwen and Lewis were getting all the love and attention from their parents, and in her mind, they were standing in the way of her getting the affection she had longed for. She even confessed that killing them would leave her as the only child in the family, guaranteeing she'd get all the love and attention she'd recently started experiencing after being adopted. Janice revealed that her ultimate goal was to take Gwen's place in the family, driven by years of emotional neglect in the orphanage where she had grown up. By December 18th, Janice's confession was officially recorded, though it was inconsistent, much like many of her previous statements. The police tracked down Aldo, who voluntarily surrendered, admitting his role too. Forensic analysis later confirmed that blood found on discarded clothing in a ditch belonged to Aldo. Like Janice, Aldo was a minor, so he was placed under the care of the Social Welfare Department. Later that same day, in an unrelated drug raid, police arrested a 17-year-old for possession of illegal substances. When they searched his phone, they found something that tied him to the case: Gwen's stolen cell phone. The serial number confirmed it had been taken after the murders. The police pieced it together. Janice had enlisted Aldo to sell the phone because she couldn't get rid of it herself due to growing suspicion. Unfortunately, the phone had been water damaged, making it impossible to retrieve any useful data. The boy who had the phone wasn't involved in the murders. He had simply bought it from Aldo. Because Janice and Aldo were minors, the police couldn't release any juicy details about their confessions to the public, despite the parents pressing for information. As the investigation progressed, Janice stopped cooperating, making it even harder to figure out exactly what had happened. Later on, it was revealed that Janice's 21-year-old boyfriend was just her imaginary boyfriend. And that really makes you question everything, especially since she had further stated that there were 3 people involved in the attack. Some people believe Janice's confessions weren't even the full story. Whispers circulated that the murders were even worse than she had let on, like the possibility that Louis was tied up and forced to watch as his sister was murdered before he was killed as well. After the shocking confessions, Lavella, the siblings' mother, was interviewed and reflected on the warning signs she missed. According to Lavella, they had adopted Janice 5 months before the murders. At first, everything seemed fine. The family welcomed her, and she appeared grateful. But soon, small red flags started to show. In August 2021, when Lavella's parents were hospitalized with COVID-19, Cruz noticed that 10,000 pesos, about $170, set aside for emergencies was missing. Janice claimed thieves had taken it, but the next day, a large sum was found hidden in her school bag. After some questioning, Janice admitted she had taken the money. Despite the breach of trust, the family, particularly Gwen, chose to forgive her. They were sympathetic to her troubled past, chalking up the theft to the survival instincts she had developed after years of hardship. Janice apologized, and the family, hoping this was a one-time mistake, accepted it, believing the worst was behind them. But as months passed, Janice's behavior started to shift in unsettling ways. Once known for her strong work ethic, which had been one of the reasons the family adopted her, she became lazy and irresponsible. Household chores were neglected, and when reminded, she apologized but never followed through. While troubling, it didn't raise any immediate alarms until the morning of the murders. That day, Janice did something she had never done before. She called Cruz and Lavella Mom and Dad for the first time. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a red flag, an indication of a deeper, darker shift in her emotional state. It was as if something had clicked in her mind, and what was about to happen was set in motion. As the investigation unfolded, more shocking truths came to light. Janice had lied about her origins from the start. Her story of being an orphan was a fabrication. Her parents were alive and had spent years desperately searching for her. When the case went viral, Filipino amateur sleuths dug into her past and uncovered a nearly decade-old missing persons notice. Like I mentioned earlier, Janice was discovered by a stranger in a cargo boat back in 2013, but no one could recognize her at the time. Her parents, especially her mom, weren't really active on Facebook back then, so they missed the post. Fast forward to the murders, and that same post started making rounds online again. It didn't take long for Janice's biological parents to recognize her. Born in 2005, Janice was the youngest of 3 kids, but her childhood was filled with chaos. Her dad's gambling addiction tore the family apart, and her mom, after remarrying, tried to make the best of things by splitting up what little they had left for her kids. Eventually, Janice and her siblings were placed in different orphanages. By 2020, Janice had actually reunited with her biological family, but that didn't last long. Her relatives later claimed she cut them off, saying they were too poor to be of any use to her. That betrayal shocked everyone, but things took a darker turn when Janice's biological mother, devastated by what her daughter had done, attended the funeral of Gwen and Louis. In her grief, she kept apologizing, full of guilt over her daughter's actions. In one heartbreaking moment, Janice's biological mom even kneeled down, but the Maguad parents weren't out for revenge. They made it clear that they weren't angry, just seeking justice. They insisted that Janice's biological mom encourage her daughter to confess. Janice's mother tried to visit her at the social welfare office, but Janice refused to see her, citing strict rules. Then, the investigation took a jaw-dropping turn. Evidence surfaced that suggested the murders were premeditated. Screenshots of a conversation between Janice and an unknown person went viral. In the messages, Janice confessed that she wanted to kill her siblings, thinking their deaths would give her the freedom she craved. She even wondered if anyone would still accept her if she committed murder, expressing a chilling belief that no matter what she did, God would forgive her if she just asked. Some sources later claimed that Janice often talked about the 2009 horror movie Orphan, a film about a young girl adopted by a family who ultimately betrays and kills them. She even posted on Facebook that she loved the movie and watched it repeatedly. When Janice's trial began, her behavior was just as disturbing as the crime itself. She was seen smiling and laughing at her parents, showing no remorse or regret. Cruz and Lavella, devastated by the loss of their children, said in interviews that they might have forgiven Janice if she had shown even a hint of genuine remorse. But her coldness only made their pain worse. The case became a national sensation in the Philippines. From March 2022, when Janice and Esmeralda were officially charged with murder, to their conviction on May 17, 2022, the case was closely followed by the public. Janice was sentenced to 31 years in prison, while Esmeralda received a 29-year sentence. However, both sentences came with one condition. They would serve them under the Department of Social Welfare and Development supervision until their 21st birthdays, after which they'd be transferred to adult prisons. Gwen and Lewis's parents had mixed feelings about the trial's outcome. While they recognized that the courts handed down the toughest punishment possible under the law, they felt the laws were too soft. The biggest issue, though, was Janice's complete lack of remorse. Cruz and Lavella were outspoken against Republic Act 9344, which limits the legal accountability of minors. According to the law, the minimum age for criminal liability is 15, and individuals between the ages of 15 and 18 can be held accountable, but they're sent to youth centers or rehab programs instead of adult prisons. This law prevents minors like Janice from being tried as adults, even for heinous crimes like hers. Many argued that kids shouldn't be capable of planning or committing such brutal acts. In the US and other countries, minors committing these kinds of crimes would have been tried as adults. Cruz and Lavella felt strongly that Janice's age shouldn't excuse her from taking full responsibility, especially for such a violent and premeditated crime. This view was shared by many who felt the law was too lenient in cases like this. The couple publicly called for changes to the law, wanting those who commit violent acts at a young age to be held fully accountable. For them, the law's focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment made them feel that the justice system had failed their family. Some of the most heartbreaking facts to come out of the investigation revealed that Gwen almost escaped. She had the chance to run, but when she heard Janice calling for help, she went back, hoping to save her adopted sister. What makes it even more disturbing is that Gwen's kindness, her willingness to return to help, was met with betrayal. Now it's your turn. What's your take on this case? Do you think the sentences were too light for the suspects? Or do you believe the justice system got it right? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This was the kind of family every man dreamed of having. Amarjeet Chohan had it all: a loving wife, adorable kids, and a thriving business worth £5 million. But just 2 days after that joyful family video was taken, they disappeared without a single clue. And it leaves you wondering, why would a happy family vanish? Could it be anything other than murder? What unfolded next sent chills through even the most hardened detectives. Police would later call this case one of the most horrifying and unique crimes they'd ever encountered. So unbelievable. It seemed like something out of a twisted thriller. The mastermind behind it came dangerously close to outsmarting the law, and by the end of this story, you'll be left stunned at how this chilling mystery was finally unraveled. To really get a sense of this story, let's take a trip back to the early 2000s, specifically 2003, and head to Heathrow, a bustling area in the United Kingdom. It was here that a thriving business called Seba Freight was making waves in the fruit import world. This wasn't just your average company. It was a booming empire. At the center of it all was a 46-year-old man named Amarjit Chohan. Most people called him Anil. Anil's journey was nothing short of inspiring. He was born in India but moved to the UK in his early 20s with big dreams of building a better life. And let me tell you, he absolutely crushed it. He worked hard, climbed the ladder of success, and eventually became the proud owner of Seba Freight, a business worth millions. But life wasn't just about business for Anil. He had a beautiful family that he adored. Anil was married to Nancy, a stunning woman who was 20 years younger than him. Together, they had 2 little boys, Davinder and Ravinder. Their home was full of love and laughter. Nancy's mother also lived with them, partly to keep Nancy company, and partly to help out since Nancy had just given birth to their second son, Ravinder. Now this family of 5 had everything you could ask for: love, success, and a bright future ahead of them. You could see how happy they were in the video footage shown in the intro. Smiles all around, kids playing, and a couple deeply in love. Life seemed picture perfect. But even with all this success, Nancy had one thing on her mind: home. She missed India deeply. The culture, the familiarity, the memories. It all pulled at her heart. She often brought it up with Anil, telling him how much she wanted to move back. She believed India's education system was better for their boys and felt they could build an even happier life there. So she wanted Anil to sell the business and start fresh in their homeland. Anil, on the other hand, wasn't one to rush big decisions like that, especially when it came to the business he had poured his heart and soul into. Now, if you ask anyone who worked for Anil, they'd tell you he was the kind of boss everyone wanted. He was known for being kind-hearted, generous, and laid back. In interviews with his team, they spoke warmly about how approachable he was. But like everyone, Anil had a past. Back in 1996, he had a run-in with the law and ended up spending 3 years in jail for tax evasion. It was a tough time, but instead of letting it define him, he used it as motivation to turn his life around. Once he was out, he poured all his energy into rebuilding his career and creating the successful empire that Seba Freight had become by the early 2000s. Fast forward to 2003, and this is where things take an interesting turn. A man named Kenneth Regan showed up, applying for a position at Anil's company. However, Kenneth wasn't your average job applicant. He was an ex-convict with a history of smuggling drugs. At first, Anil was hesitant about hiring him, but then he thought about his own past. If he could thrive after a rough patch, why not give Kenneth the same chance? So, Anil decided to hire Kenneth, giving him a fresh start as a driver. At first, everything seemed fine. Kenneth blended in with the team, and the other employees noticed nothing out of the ordinary. It was business as usual at Seba Freight. However, around this time, Anil was seriously considering Nancy's wish to move back to India. He had been mulling over the idea of selling the business, and then, as if on cue, Kenneth came in with some interesting news. Kenneth claimed he knew someone who was willing to buy the company, and not just buy it, but pay £3 million in cash. Naturally, this offer piqued Anil's interest. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to fulfill his wife's dream of returning to their homeland while also making a hefty sum from the sale of his business. So on a seemingly ordinary day, February 13, 2003, Anil left his office, supposedly heading to Wiltshire to meet with this mysterious buyer. The deal sounded promising, but here's the strange part. He didn't tell anyone exactly where he was going or even share the name of the person he was planning to meet. It was as if he trusted Kenneth's word without question, eager to explore what seemed like the perfect solution to his family's plans. But then, Anil didn't return that evening. It was as though he had simply vanished into thin air. Nancy was starting to feel more and more anxious as the night went on. She had called the company, hoping to find some clue about Anil's whereabouts, but as expected, no one had seen him. Just as she was about to panic, her phone buzzed. It was a voice message from Anil. In the message, he told her not to worry, that he was fine, and that he couldn't make it home that night. He promised he would be back the following day, but something about it didn't sit right with Nancy. This wasn't how Anil normally communicated. She and her husband always spoke to each other in Punjabi, but the message she just received, it was in English. "Hello, Nancy, don't panic. I'm okay. I'll be back tomorrow." The words sounded like Anil, but they didn't sound like him. That's when she decided to call her brother Onkar, who lived miles away in New Zealand. Onkar was a journalist, and though he hadn't seen Nancy or their mother in nearly 9 years, they still spoke almost every day. She trusted him completely and needed someone to talk to. But that call with Onkar would turn out to be the last time he ever heard from his sister. 4 days after that, on February 17, 2003, Kenneth made a shocking announcement at work. He told everyone that Anil had sold the company to a woman named Belinda Bruin. To back up this claim, he produced a letter stating that Anil had sold Seba Freight and was retiring abroad with Nancy due to ill health. The letter even had Anil's signature on it. The news took everyone by surprise. No one had expected such a major change, and naturally, the employees were now worried about their jobs with the arrival of a new owner. However, the reality of working in a busy company meant that they didn't have much time to stop and dwell on the situation. There was no time to question the announcement or voice their concerns. Everyone just had to keep working and adjust to the sudden shift, unsure of what the future held. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, Onkar, Nancy's brother, was growing increasingly concerned. After a routine missing persons inquiry, it was discovered that the family home was empty. Neighbors and colleagues all seemed to believe that the Chohans had simply packed up and moved back to India, as Nancy had wanted. But Onkar wasn't convinced. He knew that Nancy or his mom wouldn't go anywhere without telling him. So if the police couldn't find any answers, he figured he would take matters into his own hands. He decided to fly to the UK and investigate his family's disappearance himself. Alone in a foreign place, Onkar arrived in Hounslow, the family's hometown, and headed straight for the Chohan house. What he discovered there would shock him to the core, and it set him on a path that no one could have predicted. With compelling evidence that his family had left the house against their will, Onkar didn't waste any time. He went straight to the police, determined to get them to take action. After presenting his findings, he managed to convince the authorities to launch a full investigation into the mysterious disappearance of the Chohan family. The case was handed over to DCI Andy Rowell, a seasoned investigator who wasted no time in getting to work. Rowell's first step? Interviewing the last person known to have seen Anil Chohan on the day he vanished, Kenneth Regan. Now, as mentioned earlier, Kenneth Regan was no ordinary man. In fact, he had a whole collection of names. He was also known as Ken Avery, but perhaps the most intriguing nickname he had was Captain Cash. The story behind that was simple but chilling. He was said to always carry around hefty sums of cash, often tucked into a case, making him a figure known in the underworld for his money and shady dealings. Before he became a part of Seba Freight, Regan had quite a notorious past. Back in the late 90s, he was a career criminal, and not just any criminal. He was deep into the world of organized crime, running freight companies around the Heathrow area. But these companies were not just legitimate businesses. No, they were carefully crafted fronts for smuggling drugs into the country. Regan knew the ins and outs of the criminal world and had connections with some of the most powerful and dangerous criminal families in London. At the time, Kenneth Regan was living the high life, surrounded by criminals and making his money in all the wrong ways. He was enjoying the luxuries of his illegal activities: flashy clothes, expensive watches, and always rolling with a crowd of shady figures. But it was at a fashionable London bar where Regan's world collided with that of Belinda Bruin, the same woman who would later allegedly buy the company from Anil. Back then, She was a celebrity agent and socialite, living in the fast lane of the social scene. Belinda described Reagan as a bit rough around the edges, not well educated but charming in his own way. She saw him as the classic rich wide boy type, the kind of guy who thought his money could buy him class. As time went on, Reagan became fixated on Belinda. His obsession started when he began calling and emailing her relentlessly, saying things like, "I haven't felt like this in 30 years. You're like a drug." Rumors soon started circulating that they were in a relationship, though that was never officially confirmed. But on June 17, 1998, Reagan's world came crashing down. He was caught with 25 kilograms of heroin, a massive stash. Facing a daunting 18 years in prison, Reagan quickly made a deal to turn on his former associates and became a grass. His testimony led to the conviction of 12 major criminals, and in return, his sentence was reduced. 4 years later, when he was released from prison, Reagan found himself with nothing. His assets had been seized through a confiscation order, leaving him in a small one-bedroom bungalow with his father. Despite his fall from grace, Reagan wasn't ready to give up on his criminal ways. He was determined to make a comeback. And the perfect opportunity came in the form of Anil Chohan's thriving freight company. Reagan saw it as the perfect front for his drug-dealing operations. Once again, he was planning to use a legitimate business to cover up his illegal activities. By this time, Belinda Bruin had given up her house in Chelsea for a fresh start in Devon. Reagan's obsessive calls and letters had stopped during his 4 years in prison, but now that he was free, he began to pursue her once again. A few weeks after his release, Reagan left Belinda a series of messages on her mobile, flirting with her. But in January of 2003, he left a message that piqued her curiosity, claiming he had a business deal he wanted to discuss. At the time, Belinda was dealing with personal struggles. She had a huge house, a large mortgage, 2 kids in private school, and her boyfriend had just left her. She decided to call him back. Reagan told Belinda he was planning to take over Seba Freight and needed a new managing director. Although she had no experience in the field, Reagan offered her a huge salary for just a 2-day work week. At first, he offered her £54,000, which she thought wasn't enough to cover her expenses. He quickly increased the offer to £72,000, which seemed more appealing. This job offer gave Reagan a convenient excuse to visit Belinda at her isolated home in Devon. He'd come up with bizarre reasons for needing her help with forms or letters, and he would drive all the way from Salisbury or London just for a brief visit. Reagan seemed increasingly fixated on the land around Belinda's farm, constantly complaining about the mud in the lane and suggesting ways to improve the property, like cutting down trees and building a wall with electric gates. Fast forward to February, 1 month after Reagan had told Belinda about the job offer, and things were finally falling into place. Belinda was given a desk and a computer, and she began reviewing the company's books as Reagan had instructed. However, on her second day, she felt unwell and decided to drive home to Devon instead of going to work. When she arrived, she was shocked to see a battered Jaguar and 2 men in her field with a digger. The men were William Hornsey and Peter Reese, both associates of Reagan. Belinda was furious and demanded to know what they were doing. They explained they were building a drainage ditch. Belinda couldn't believe it. It wasn't just the ditch, it was the fact that they had done this without her permission. Reagan arrived and tried to justify the digging by saying, "I thought you'd appreciate it." Belinda was livid. She made it clear that it was her land and they had no right to dig it up. Though she planned to have it removed, she was told to wait until summer. By 2003, Reagan was on the brink of reclaiming his former millionaire lifestyle. He had taken control of Seba Freight, Anil Chohan's former company, which now served as an ideal front for his drug-dealing operations. For years, Reagan had obsessively pursued Belinda Bruin from afar, and now she was on his payroll. It seemed as though Reagan's dreams were finally coming true, but the dark secret behind his success was about to be exposed. When detectives sat down with Kenneth Regan to ask about the Chohan family, they were met with a story that seemed almost too perfect. Regan painted Anil Chohan as a desperate businessman, drowning in financial woes and unable to sell his business. His version of events suggested that, with no other options left, Chohan had simply vanished into thin air. It was a convenient narrative, but one the detectives weren't willing to buy. Using cutting-edge forensic technology, the investigators tracked both Regan and Chohan's mobile phone movements on the day of the disappearance. What they uncovered was nothing short of chilling. Chohan's phone, initially traced to the Hounslow area, suddenly pinged in the Stonehenge area just days after his disappearance. This wasn't far from Regan's home in Wilton, Salisbury, and the detectives quickly connected the dots. Regan's phone had met up with Chohan's in that very location. From there, the two phones traveled south, moving toward Exeter in the West Country, a path that seemed more than coincidental. But the detectives' pursuit didn't stop there. They found a lead that seemed almost too unlikely to ignore. Devon, the home of Belinda Bruin, the newly appointed managing director of SEBA. The police planned to visit her, thinking she might know more than she was letting on. However, just when they were about to get answers, a tip arrived from a man named William Hornsey, an associate of Regan. Hornsey claimed to have important information about Chohan's whereabouts, stating that Chohan was very much alive and on the run. Hornsey's revelation that he was meeting Chohan in Newport to hand over stolen passports seemed like the break the detectives had been waiting for. They rushed to Newport, heading straight to the location Hornsey had described, the iconic bronze pig statue near the passport office. There they found Hornsey and Regan standing nervously, but something wasn't right. It was as if they were trying to spin the story into something else. Hornsey and Regan claimed that Chohan couldn't make it because, allegedly, he had somehow discovered that they were meeting with the police. The detectives, trying to piece things together, attempted to trace the phone Chohan supposedly used, but their efforts were in vain. The number led to an unregistered phone, and once again, they were left with nothing but frustration and the sinking feeling that they were being misled, pulled further into a web of lies. Back at SEBA, Regan resumed his work like nothing had happened, as if he wasn't at the center of an investigation. But the detectives weren't about to let this slip through the cracks. They called Belinda in for questioning, determined to get to the bottom of things. When Regan learned that Belinda was being questioned, his anger flared. He immediately warned her, telling her that if the police ever asked about his work on her property, she was to simply say he was helping with her water system. So on the day of the questioning, Belinda answered every question the detectives threw at her, but when it seemed like the interview was wrapping up, the detectives asked her if there was anything unusual about Regan's behavior. That's when Belinda hesitated before mentioning one peculiar detail. Regan had told her that if the police asked about him, she should say he was just helping with her water system. That one statement threw the detectives off. Without a moment's hesitation, they rushed to Devon, convinced that something grisly awaited them at Belinda's farm. They meticulously excavated the dig site where Regan had been working, conducting an exhaustive forensic search. Forensic archaeologists and pathologists worked tirelessly, but after 5 long days of digging, no bodies were uncovered. At this point, it seemed like they were hitting a dead end. No physical evidence tied Regan to any crime, and the case was on the verge of becoming a cold one. That is, until April of 2003, when a father and son duo decided to go on a leisurely evening paddle near Bournemouth Pier. As they glided through the water, something caught their eye, a bloated, lifeless body floating just beneath the surface. The body was unnervingly large and bloated, the feet floating above the water while the torso and face were submerged. The son immediately called emergency services, unable to shake the sight of the floating corpse. For nearly 3 long hours, the father stayed there, making sure the body would be found and the situation wouldn't go unnoticed. In an interview, he later recalled how that moment gave him absolute chills through his spine. The body was taken to a mortuary in Bournemouth. But it would be nearly a week before the authorities could confirm the unthinkable. It was indeed Anil Chohan, the missing businessman. But the truth was far more chilling than anyone had imagined. An autopsy revealed a horrifying sequence of events. Anil had suffered blunt force trauma to the back of his head, a brutal blow that had left him unconscious. But it didn't end there. Packing tape had been wrapped tightly around his mouth, clear evidence of suffocation after the head injury. The forensic experts concluded that the combination of the blow to his head and the suffocation was the likely cause of his tragic death. While the police were still processing this shocking discovery, the search for more evidence pressed on. This time, investigators were zeroing in on Belinda Bruin's farm in Devon, hoping to find something that would link all the pieces together. And they did. As they dug deeper, they uncovered burnt clothes, jewelry, and even some hairs buried in the soil, clues that pointed to a burial site on Belinda's land. After forensic testing, it was confirmed. The hairs belonged to Anil Chohan, and it became clear he had been murdered, buried at the farm, dug up later, and dumped into the sea near Bournemouth. The size of the excavation site raised even more questions. If they were just trying to hide one body, why dig such a large area? The detectives uncovered more clues, including jewelry that seemed to belong to Nancy, Anil's wife, and small poppers from baby clothes. It was a chilling realization. Anil's entire family might have been buried there too. With this new evidence, the investigation shifted gears. The case was upgraded to a Category A murder inquiry, the highest priority level. From then on, Kenneth Regan was the prime suspect, but both he and his associate, William Hornsey, had mysteriously disappeared. One day, as Belinda was driving home, she noticed something strange, a familiar car parked near her property. Her heart sank when she realized it belonged to Regan and Hornsey. There was no mistaking it. They were back, and it wasn't a casual visit. These were the same men she believed had dug a mysterious ditch on her land, a ditch she suspected was used to hide bodies. Her instincts screamed that something was off, but she stayed calm. Smiling nervously, she told them she needed to grab something from her shed and would return in a couple of minutes. The moment she was out of their sight, Belinda bolted to her car, heart racing, and sped off. She called the police immediately, describing the situation in detail. Officers were dispatched to her home, but by the time they arrived, Regan and Hornsey were gone. Not a single clue was left behind. That was the last time anyone ever saw the two men. But the story didn't end there. Days after the Chohan family had vanished, Belinda remembered something critical. There had been 3 men on her property that day. That meant someone else was still out there, and she was convinced it was Peter Reese. Now on his own, Reese was left to wrestle with the weight of his choices. As the days turned into weeks, guilt began to consume him. He bounced between hostels and boarding houses, always looking over his shoulder, knowing the police were closing in. One evening, while staying at a small boarding house, Reese struck up a conversation with the landlady. In a moment of weakness, he confessed everything. "Have you seen me on TV?" he asked her. When she said no, he unloaded the horrifying truth. He admitted that he was involved in covering up the disappearance and murder of an entire family. Reese insisted he hadn't killed anyone, but he admitted to helping hide the bodies. He even painted a chilling picture of Regan, calling him a psycho who had personally shot 2 babies. The landlady, shocked and terrified, knew she had to act. As soon as she had the chance, she alerted the authorities. Within 12 days, the police caught up to Reese. He was still on the run, moving from place to place like a shadow. But even after his earlier confession, Reese refused to cooperate. He wouldn't share any details about the murders or reveal where the victims were buried, leaving the authorities with more questions than answers. While the police were interrogating Reese, they received shocking news. A fisherman had discovered a decomposed body floating in the water. The body was so deteriorated that the police hesitated to show it to Unkar, fearing it would be too traumatizing. But Unkar insisted it was his baby sister, Nancy. He couldn't imagine not seeing her one last time, even though this was the first time he'd see her in 9 years. And it was after her death. 2 months after the disappearance, the police finally found Kenneth Regan hiding in Belgium. They brought him back to England to face justice. Surprisingly, 6 weeks after Regan's arrest, William Hornsey voluntarily turned himself in to the authorities. With Peter Reese already in custody, all 3 suspects were now under police watch. However, none of them cooperated. They stayed silent, refusing to answer questions or share details that could tie them to the crime. Even with all 3 men in custody, the police were still missing something crucial. Nancy's mother and her 2 babies hadn't been found. Without strong evidence, the police couldn't make a solid case for conviction. They needed more clues to ensure justice. That's when they decided to dig into the suspect's phone records, especially on the day Amarjeet met Regan at Stonehenge. What they found painted a grim picture. The record showed all 3 men traveling south to Salisbury, stopping at an apartment located at 3 Forge Close, the address of Kenneth Regan's home. The detective who led the investigation pieced together an alarming timeline. During the time Anil Chohan was missing, at least one of the 3 men was always at Regan's apartment. This led detectives to believe Anil was being held captive there, guarded round the clock to ensure he couldn't escape. It was during this time that the 2 men carried out their cruel plan, abducting the entire family from their home. The police believed that Anil was killed at Regan's apartment, while Nancy, her mother Charanjit, and the 2 babies met their tragic end in Hounslow. Despite this horrifying theory, the evidence the police had was purely circumstantial. They had no solid proof linking the suspects directly to the murders, and without it, their case remained shaky. When detectives searched Kenneth Regan's apartment, they found no signs of a struggle or violence. The place had been meticulously cleaned and redecorated. Regan had installed new carpets, replaced the couch covers, and made it seem as if nothing sinister had ever happened there. He had wiped away nearly all traces of what could have been crucial evidence. At this point, while the investigation strongly pointed to Regan and his associates, the jury needed more than just theories and suspicions to convict them. The entire nation was watching the case unfold, gripped by the horror of what had happened to this innocent family. People across the country demanded justice for Anil, Nancy, their 2 young children, and Nancy's mother. Yet, with each passing day, hope seemed to dim as investigators struggled to find that one solid piece of evidence. Just when it seemed like the case might fall apart, a breakthrough came, one that no one could have anticipated. This pivotal moment came from Anil Chohan himself, even in death. When his body was discovered, every item of clothing he was wearing was carefully preserved by forensic investigators. His shirt, pants, and shoes were thoroughly examined, but nothing was found at first. Months passed, and it seemed like the evidence they needed simply wasn't there. Then, 8 months after Anil's body was recovered, investigators took another look at his socks. And that's when they made a startling discovery. Tightly folded and hidden inside his sock was a single piece of paper. It was a letter, dated February 12, 2003, the exact day Anil had disappeared. The letter was addressed to Kenneth Regan at 3 Forge Close, Regan's home address. Investigators believed that while Anil was being held captive, he realized he wouldn't survive. In his final desperate moments, he thought of a way to leave behind a clue that would point to his killer. He folded the letter over and over again until it was small enough to hide in his sock, hoping it would remain undiscovered by his captors. The letter survived Anil's burial, the time his body spent in the water, and the months it took for investigators to find it. It was a testament to Anil's incredible courage and determination to seek justice for himself and his family, even when he knew he wouldn't live to see it. With the letter in hand, the case against Regan, Reese, and Hornsey was solid. No jury could deny their involvement in the horrific murders. The trial began in 2005, 2 years after the crimes. It was one of the longest and most chilling criminal trials in the history of England's Central Criminal Court. The proceedings revealed the depth of Reagan's greed and cruelty, and the lengths he was willing to go to cover his tracks. Peter Rees, who had played a supporting role in the crimes, was sentenced to 23 years in prison. Kenneth Reagan and William Hornsey, the masterminds of the plan, each received 5 consecutive life sentences, ensuring they would never walk free again. Peter Rees, who had played a supporting role in the crimes, was sentenced to 23 years in prison. Kenneth Reagan and William Hornsey, the masterminds of the plan, each received 5 consecutive life sentences, ensuring they would never walk free again. As the investigation continued, more heartbreaking discoveries were made. The body of Nancy's mother, Charanjit Kaur, was found off the coast of the Isle of Wight. Like Anil and Nancy, she had been drowned. However, the bodies of the 2 youngest victims, 1-year-old Davender and 8-week-old Ravender, were never recovered. Though justice was served in the courtroom, the emotional scars left behind were immeasurable. Onkar, Nancy's brother, carried the weight of grief and unanswered questions. In an interview, Onkar couldn't hold back his tears as he wondered what his family had endured in their final moments and whether they had held on to hope for rescue. This case remains one of the most horrific crimes ever, with the sheer brutality of it all sending chills down the spine. What makes it even more disturbing is the innocence of the family involved, their lives cruelly taken in such a violent manner. The idea that 2 young children were caught in the middle of this violence is almost too much to comprehend. Now, we want to hear your thoughts. Do you think the sentencing was just right for those responsible, or could this have been a case where life for a life should have been considered? Was justice truly served, or does this tragedy deserve something more? Drop your thoughts below and let's discuss.
Directly to the killer, who may be in this room. We believe you are hiding in plain sight. For more than 2 years, you never thought we would shift gears to a different investigative strategy, but we have.
They say having a best friend means having someone to lean on. And for Libby and Abigail, that was true right up until their tragic end. Just hours after Libby posted this photo online, she and Abigail vanished without a trace, sparking one of Delphi's most chilling mysteries. Over the years, eerie theories have circulated, with some suggesting the girls were sacrifices in a dark cult, a theory that, shockingly, investigators haven't entirely dismissed. But is that what really happened? Or was the killer just clever enough to stay hidden? Trust me, this case will leave you questioning everything as we uncover every haunting detail of what happened to these 2 best friends.
The result of the new information and intelligence over time leads us to believe the sketch, which you will see shortly, is the person responsible for the murders of these 2 little girls.
This press conference held in 2019 had everyone on edge. Doug Carter from the Indiana State Police delivered a chilling message to the unknown killer, saying they were likely hiding in plain sight, blending into the very community shaken by one of its most brutal cases. Now, to understand the gravity of his warning, we need to go back 2 years earlier to Monday, February 13th, 2017. Abigail Williams, 13, and Liberty German, 14, known as Libby, were the type of best friends who did everything together. That Sunday night, they were at Libby's house, excited about a rare Monday off from school. Abby had brought along a box of arts and crafts supplies, and the 2 spent the evening working on projects in Libby's room and tossing a softball around in the backyard. By Monday afternoon, their creative energy turned into a craving for adventure. The girls came up with a plan to visit a local nature reserve near the Manon High Bridge, a well-known hangout spot in Delphi. They convinced Libby's older sister Kelsey to drive them there, and by 1:30 in the afternoon, They were dropped off near the bridge. Now, the area was a mix of rugged beauty and quiet charm, with wooded trails that led to the towering Monon High Bridge. This old railway bridge, built in 1891, had long been abandoned, but still attracted locals who came to enjoy the view, snap photos, and soak in the peaceful atmosphere. It was the perfect spot for two best friends to explore, laugh, and make memories. But what started as a fun adventure that day would soon turn into a nightmare, a tragedy that shook Delphi to its core. At around 2:07 in the afternoon, Libby shared a photo on Snapchat of Abby carefully walking across the old weathered wooden planks of the Monon High Bridge. Now, that photo would turn out to be the last known sign of the two best friends. Later that day, when Libby's dad arrived to pick them up, the girls were nowhere in sight. At first, there was confusion, then growing panic as calls to their phones went unanswered. Libby's dad searched the area, calling their names, but the only response was the quiet of the woods. He reached out to Kelsey, asking if she'd heard from the girls or if he was in the wrong spot. She hadn't, and he wasn't. By evening, the fear set in. The police were called, and what started as a search by family quickly grew into a massive community effort. Search crews combed the trails and woods surrounding the bridge, while locals joined in, shouting for Abby and Libby. Attempts to trace the girls' cell phones led nowhere. According to the locals, that night was filled with flashlights flickering in the woods, looking like stars as everyone in the community came together to search for Abby and Libby. Some people thought maybe the girls just went off somewhere or were partying, but their families weren't buying it. As the hours passed, the search was called off just before midnight, with law enforcement reassuring everyone that there was no evidence the girls were in immediate danger and that the search would pick back up in the morning. The next day, February 14th, everyone was still holding on to hope, praying for a miracle. But then a shocking discovery was made. One of the search team members found Abby and Libby, but it wasn't good. The girls had been murdered, and their bodies were discovered less than a mile from where they'd been dropped off the day before. The authorities were now focused on finding who was responsible, but despite the many tips that flooded in, the killer's identity stayed hidden for months. This small town of just about 3,000 people was rocked to its core. The idea that two young girls were murdered in broad daylight seemed unfathomable, and the shock was felt throughout the entire community. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence came from Libby's own phone. Police discovered that Libby had been filming Abby as she walked across the bridge. In that video, she also captured the voice and image of a man walking alongside them. The man in the footage became known as Bridge Guy. Authorities believe this man is their killer. In hopes of getting public help, the authorities released still photos from the video, not the full footage, but enough to hopefully spark someone's memory. They also created a sketch based on witness descriptions of a man seen on the trail that day. Bridge Guy was described as a white man, around 5'6" to 5'10", weighing between 180 and 220 pounds with reddish-brown hair. The grainy photos showed a man in blue jeans, a blue jacket, and a hoodie. Police had also released 2 sketches based on descriptions from eyewitnesses. One sketch looked like an older man, while the other resembled a younger man. Despite all of this, no arrests were made. So, in an effort to push the investigation forward, the authorities released a clip of the man's voice, heard saying, "Down the hill," in the footage that Libby had captured. This new piece of evidence was meant to stir up public interest and hopefully spark a lead. At the time, the police referred to the video as coming from possible criminal activity, trying to keep the focus on finding the person responsible. Another key detail that investigators shared was that they believed the murderer either lived in Delphi or was familiar with the town. Whether they worked there or had some other connection, the killer had knowledge of the area, and that detail kept everyone on edge, hoping someone would recognize the voice, the face, or the details and help crack the case wide open. In April of 2019, More than 2 years after Libby and Abby were found murdered, law enforcement held another press conference that grabbed everyone's attention. It was during this conference that ISP Superintendent Doug Carter made a direct appeal to the killer, telling him, "I know you're hiding in plain sight." He went on to say, "I believe you have just a little bit of a conscience left, and I can assure you that how you left them in that woods is not what they're experiencing today." By this point, the police had received a lot of tips, and there were quite a few people linked to the case as potential suspects. Some of them matched the 2 sketches police had released, but one name that came up early was Ron Logan. He was an older guy who lived in Delphi, Indiana, and his connection to the case wasn't just because of his age, it was because of where he lived. The bodies of Libby and Abby were found less than a mile from Logan's property, just a short walk from the Monon High Bridge, the spot where the girls were last seen. In a small town like Delphi, that kind of proximity made Logan a prime person of interest right off the bat. Logan had lived on a quiet country road near the trail that led to the Monon High Bridge for over 50 years. It was a peaceful area where families often walked, so it seemed like the last place something horrible like this could happen. But once the girls' bodies were discovered, that peaceful spot felt much darker and more sinister. Now, Logan didn't exactly help himself. When the girls went missing, he told the police he had been out of town at an aquarium, which seemed like a pretty solid alibi. But then things started to take a strange turn. It came out that Logan had asked a relative to lie for him about his whereabouts that day. That raised a huge red flag. If he had nothing to hide, why would he try to cover up where he was? Things got even more complicated a month after the murders when the FBI stepped in. In March 2017, the FBI got the green light to search Ronald Logan's property, including his house, garage, pickup truck, computers, and cell phones. In the warrant request, the FBI agent made it clear that there was probable cause to believe Logan had committed the murders and that evidence could be found on his land. The agent even went into detail about why they thought Logan was involved. But before we dive into that, the request revealed some new details about the crime scene that had never been shared before. First, the FBI confirmed that one of the victims was missing a piece of clothing. There were no signs of a struggle or fight at the crime scene, and investigators found fibers and unidentified hairs. It also appeared that the bodies had been moved and staged. The agent even referenced the infamous video on Libby's phone, confirming that it was 43 seconds long, though up until then, only a few seconds had been released to the public. The footage showed the suspect following the girls on the Monon High Bridge trail, and there were no visible signs of a fight. The search warrant for Logan's property, which was located right next to where the girls' bodies were found, revealed more suspicious details. The FBI agent said Logan had asked a relative to create a fake alibi for the afternoon the girls went missing. On top of that, cell tower data showed Logan's phone was in the area where the girls disappeared, and later that night, it was near where the bodies were eventually discovered. Logan's ex-girlfriends also spoke out, revealing disturbing details about his behavior. Both reported that he had been physically abusive, with one woman stating that Logan had threatened her, saying he could kill her and no one would ever find her body. The agent also mentioned that the victims lost a lot of blood, and it was almost certain that the killer would have gotten blood on their person or clothing. Additionally, 2 pieces of clothing from one of the girls were missing, and it seemed like the bodies had been intentionally moved and staged. The agent speculated that the killer might have taken a souvenir or done something to memorialize the crime scene. As investigators scoured Logan's property, they were hoping to find something that could link him to the murders. Logan, however, continued to insist that he had been in Lafayette, 20 miles away, buying tropical fish, and he didn't return home until 6:30 in the evening. But when police looked into his alibi, they found that his cousin, who was supposedly with him, didn't back up his story. In fact, they couldn't confirm any of Logan's alibi details. Despite the investigation, including extensive searches of his property, nothing concrete was found to directly tie Logan to the murders. He did have a history of legal troubles, including a previous DUI conviction, and as part of his probation, he wasn't allowed to drive. Investigators believed that was why he had asked his relative to lie for him. In a twist, Logan was later arrested for violating his probation, though it was unrelated to the Delphi murders. This gave investigators the chance to search his property again while he was in custody, but once again, no direct evidence was found that linked him to the crime. Suspicions surrounding Logan officially died down when he passed away in 2020 due to COVID-19. But just when it seemed like things had gone cold, another person of interest came to light. This time, it's a man named Keegan Anthony Klein. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. At the time, Klein was 30 years old and had a disturbing history of internet catfishing. One of the accounts he used was under the username Anthony Shots. Police believe that the Anthony Shots Instagram profile was used to solicit explicit pictures from young girls. But the story gets darker. Klein was actually chatting with Libby German on the day of the murders. Not only that, but he allegedly told another girl that he was supposed to meet Libby that day. It was hard to ignore the eerie coincidence. The last person to speak to Libby was an online predator. Was it just a twist of fate? Or did Klein somehow know the killer? Could he have been involved in the crime in some way? Police didn't waste time and searched his home in Peru, Indiana. Now, Klein was never formally charged with the murders, but what they found in his home was enough to lead to serious charges. During the search, investigators uncovered explicit images of children, which led to his arrest on charges of child exploitation and possession of child pornography. Indiana State Police Officer Christopher Cecil testified that Klein used fake personas to convince girls, ranging from 12 to 18 years old, to send him explicit photos or videos. Investigators identified 11 victims, but they suspected there were even more who had not yet come forward. In a 2022 jailhouse interview, Klein admitted to trying to solicit explicit images from underage girls. However, he claimed that he never intended to meet any of them in real life, saying he was simply lonely and didn't really know why he did it.
Consider yourself like a pedophile?
No, I would not. That's even what I put in the PSI now. Like I told it in the PSI, when I'm out in public, I don't look at teenage girls or kids. I don't think sexually about them at all. No.
What do you think happened in terms of then, some of the things you're accused of doing?
Like I told in the PSI, it just kind of spiraled out. I mean, I didn't have a girlfriend. I was a lonely guy, and I started talking to girls online, and it just kind of spiraled into something, and I don't know. It's crazy.
Klein pled guilty to the charges and was sentenced to 40 years in prison with an additional 3 years suspended. His sentence was a reminder of the severity of his crimes, but it still didn't bring closure to the case of Abby and Libby. This was in 2022, 5 years after the horrific murders, and many feared that justice might never come. For years, it seemed like the case had gone cold. Investigators had little progress, and the community was growing increasingly frustrated. Then, on October 26th that same year, everything changed when 50-year-old Richard Allen was arrested and charged with the murders of Abby and Libby. The news hit like a bombshell. Richard Allen wasn't some stranger or distant figure. He was a familiar face in the small town of Delphi, a family man, married with a daughter, and working at the local CVS pharmacy. Shockingly, he had even printed memorial photos for the victims' families. How could someone so deeply embedded in the community be capable of such an awful crime? It seemed unimaginable. But perhaps, just maybe, Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter's words from 3 years earlier had been eerily accurate. The killer is hiding in plain sight. The case, which had seemed nearly impossible to solve, was now taking a startling turn. No one had anticipated how challenging this case would be to crack. Nearly 6 years of relentless searching, over 70,000 tips, countless sketches of potential suspects, and even the famous grainy video from Libby's phone all failed to lead them to the killer. As investigators finally closed in on Allen, it raised the question, how had they missed him for so long? Why did it take so long for this piece of the puzzle to fall into place? As it turns out, Richard Allen, who had been a local man in Delphi for years, had put himself on the trail the day of the murders, wearing the exact same clothing as the bridge guy described by witnesses. Even more chilling were the accounts from several witnesses who claimed to have seen someone resembling Richard on the trail that day. One witness even reported seeing a man walking down the road covered in muddy and bloody clothes. Then, investigators discovered an unused bullet at the crime scene that matched a gun owned by Richard Allen. This was a major piece of evidence that tied him directly to the crime. The arrest was swift, but Richard's defense team immediately released a statement, trying to set the record straight about their client and the ongoing investigation. The defense made several key points in their statement, and I'll quote them directly here. Richard is a 50-year-old man who has never been arrested nor accused of any crime in his entire life. He is innocent and completely confused as to why he has been charged with these crimes. The police did not contact Rick after Libby German and Abby Williams went missing. Rather, Rick contacted the police and voluntarily discussed being on the trail that day. Like many people in Delphi, Rick wanted to help in any way he could. He contacted the police to let them know that he had walked on the trail that day, as he often did. Without Rick coming forward, the police probably would not have even had any way of knowing that he was on the trail that day. Rick volunteered to meet with a conservation officer outside of the local grocery store to offer details of his trip to the trail. Rick tried to assist with the investigation and told the police that he did recall seeing 3 younger girls on the trail that day. His contact with the girls was brief and of little significance. Rick does not recall if his interaction with the conservation officer was tape recorded, but he believes the officer scribbled notes on a notepad as Rick spoke to him. The statement continued, stating that after Rick provided this information, he went back to his job at the local CVS and didn't hear from the police for more than 5 years. The next time he heard from law enforcement was in October 2022, right around the time of a contested sheriff's election. The timing seemed a bit suspicious to some. The defense team also pointed to the fact that Richard had not disposed of his vehicle, guns, or clothing in the 5 years since he voluntarily spoke to the police. He hadn't changed his appearance or relocated. Instead, he continued with his normal routine, which the defense argued was the behavior of an innocent man. However, things took another unexpected turn when months later, new documents revealed shocking details. The records indicated that Richard had allegedly confessed to the murders, not just once, but multiple times. These confessions were reportedly made during phone calls with his wife, Kathy, and even with his own mother. In each of these instances, Kathy would allegedly end the call abruptly. After these confessions, Richard's mental health rapidly deteriorated. He lost weight, stopped eating and sleeping, and even broke his tablet, his only connection to the outside world. He began acting out, engaging in bizarre behaviors, such as eating legal documents from his attorneys. This revelation took the case to an even darker place. The defense argued that these confessions were made under extreme mental distress due to Richard's protective confinement, and that they were not reliable. Despite the defense's concerns, the judge refused to move Richard to another facility, stating that he was actually receiving better treatment than other inmates in the same prison. But the plot thickened once again. The defense filed a bizarre 136-page memorandum which shifted the focus away from Richard Allen and pointed the finger at a group of individuals following a pagan Norse religion known as Odinism. These individuals, the defense claimed, were responsible for the murders. In the memorandum, the defense referenced an FBI agent's disclosure in 2017, which revealed that the bodies of Abby and Libby appeared to have been manipulated and deliberately staged. Prior to this, very little was known about the crime scene. No autopsy results had been shared, and only text messages, allegedly written by Abby's Uncle David, had circulated online. These texts revealed details about the girls' bodies. They were found near each other, touching but not bound. Abby was clothed, but Libby was naked, with leaves and sticks covering the top half of her body. Their throats had allegedly been cut. The most shocking part of this new development was the defense's claim that symbols resembling runes, associated with Odinism, had been found at the crime scene. They argued that these symbols were left behind by individuals connected to this Odinist cult, shifting the focus away from Richard and suggesting a far darker and more complex narrative. One of the more striking elements was the discovery of Libby's body, found positioned at the base of a tree. Her left arm was extended above her head, touching the tree, while her right arm lay by her side. Numerous branches were placed over her in a deliberate pattern, including one large branch running from her head to her legs. The defense suggested that the lack of blood near Libby's neck and tree indicated she may have been killed elsewhere before being moved. Abby's body, found just a few feet away, was fully clothed but dressed in Libby's jeans and sweatshirt. The defense proposed that Abby had been killed earlier and then redressed by the alleged perpetrators. Despite fatal neck wounds, little blood was found on her clothing, except around her neck, implying efforts to keep her body clean. Abby's body was positioned with her right leg bent beneath her left leg, and branches were arranged in a pattern on top of her, resembling an asterisk. The defense also noted that one of the branches appeared to be cleanly cut, suggesting premeditation. Above Abby's head, smaller sticks were placed over her hair, mimicking horns or antlers. Further unsettling details included a red F-shaped stain on a nearby tree, confirmed to be Libby's blood. The defense argued that this symbol resembled the Norse rune Ansuz, which stands for Odin. They also pointed to the symbol Hagalaz found on Abby's body, linking it to the Norse god of hail. The defense theorized that these runes suggested a ritualistic motive behind the killings. The defense challenged the prosecution's timeline, which suggested the murders occurred within a short window, claiming it was implausible for one person, especially someone of Richard Allen's small stature, to have committed the murders alone. They raised questions about the discovery of a bullet buried between the girls and its connection to a gun owned by Allen, asking when it was found, immediately after the bodies were discovered or days later. The defense argued that the murders required more time than one person could manage in such a short window. The defense also pointed to the connection between Abby and Odinism. Abby's alleged boyfriend's father, known as BH, had ties to Odinism and social media posts resembling the symbols found at the crime scene. The defense claimed that BH had made references to the crime scene before details were publicly released. The theory also included the disturbing meme posted by BH days after the murders, joking about helping dispose of bodies and remaining silent. Another potential suspect was mentioned by the defense, who claimed he admitted to being involved in the murders. The defense also alleged that several law enforcement officers involved in the investigation privately believed in the Odinism theory, but were suppressed to focus on Allen. In terms of Allen's mental health, the defense argued that his deteriorating condition in prison may have led to coerced confessions. They claimed that threats from Odinist members working as guards had pressured him into confessing. Additionally, they accused the lead investigator of withholding crucial evidence to gain a search warrant for Allen's home. Another significant issue raised was the destruction of evidence. The defense claimed that 70 days' worth of interviews with witnesses had been destroyed, which could have been crucial in the early stages of the investigation. This led to further frustrations from the defense as they sought to challenge the prosecution's case. During a 3-day hearing in 2024, the defense's Odinism theory was debated, with the prosecution presenting evidence to refute it. The prosecution called in a blood spatter expert who testified that the blood on the tree was a transfer stain, not painted, though the expert couldn't determine who transferred the blood. The defense also argued that Allen's confessions, over 60 in total, were coerced and should not be admissible in court. They argued that Alan's mental health had worsened due to his severe treatment in a maximum security facility, leading to stress-induced psychosis. Several witnesses testified to Alan's deteriorating condition, including his bizarre behavior and his eventual confession to the murders. A DNA expert also testified that there was no trace of Alan's DNA at the crime scene, and there was also no sign of Libby or Abby's DNA on any of the items found at his home. So, while his confession seemed to be a big step toward closing the case, physical evidence wasn't quite backing up his involvement.
But today we heard there's no DNA evidence connecting Alan to this crime, right?
Yeah, Scott, we got some very technical and very scientific testimony today. One talking about DNA evidence, another talking about blood patterns. It made for a really hard day for both the families and for the jurors in court.
The only key piece of evidence prosecutors focused on was the .40 caliber bullet found near the girls' bodies. An expert for the prosecution claimed it matched Alan's gun, but the defense wasn't buying it, pointing out that there weren't enough images taken of the cartridge and even suggested that the bullet could have come from a law enforcement officer's weapon. That raised a lot of eyebrows about the reliability of this piece of evidence. The prosecution also worked hard to link Alan to the chilling Bridge Guy video and audio recording taken by Libby on her phone just before the girls were murdered. State Police Master Trooper Brian Harshman, who reviewed over 700 of Alan's prison calls, testified that in his opinion, the voice on that recording matched Alan's voice. It was a bold statement, but some still had their doubts. Then, the moment arrived. On November 11th, 2024, Alan was convicted on all counts. Just a month later, on December 20th, 2024, Judge Gull sentenced him to 130 years in prison, 65 years for each of the girls' murders, to be served consecutively. He was immediately transported to the Westville Correctional Facility to start serving his time. But here's the thing, while some people were relieved to see justice served, there's still a big divide. A lot of people are questioning how it took 5 years for anyone to connect Alan to the case. There were those sketches, the videos, the voices, so why didn't anyone think to investigate Alan sooner? And let's not forget that his arrest happened just in time for a sheriff election, which raised even more suspicions. Was it all just a coincidence, or was there more to the story? This has sparked some serious debates. What do you think? Was Alan really the killer, or do you think it might have been Logan, the first suspect? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.